Berlin at night holds a peculiar quiet, one shaped not by peace but by the weight of things that cannot be spoken aloud. Street lamps spill narrow pools of weak light onto cobblestones, revealing buildings wrapped in blackout curtains, stairwells where sound seems to hesitate before continuing, and doorways that swallow footsteps faster than they create them. You follow that quiet through dim corridors and narrow residential blocks, into a city where every conversation might be overheard and every face in the window might belong to someone watching. Before you drift off, if you find these calm journeys meaningful, feel free to subscribe so you don't miss the next quiet chapter. And let us know where you're listening from, or which moment stays with you the most. You're listening to Echoes of War. Fear has a texture here. It lives in the pauses between sentences, in the way people lower their heads when uniformed men pass, and in the way ordinary rooms begin to look like hiding places. You take in the atmosphere carefully, knowing that what moves beneath it is not silence but resistance. Officially, Germany in the early 1940s presents itself as unified, disciplined, and unwavering in obedience to the Führer. But below that controlled surface, small clusters of people begin to push back, not through guns or open revolt, but through thought, information, and moral refusal. They are students, artists, officers, clerks, civil servants, writers. Some move in elite circles, others scrape by modestly. They share almost nothing except a growing certainty. The regime ruling their country cannot be allowed to stand unchallenged. This certainty does not come with sweeping speeches or barricades. It comes in the quiet moments, behind closed doors, in coded letters, in a shared glance when a newspaper headline reveals another atrocity. Their strength lies not in numbers, but in commitment. You follow that thread of commitment into apartments filled with books, cigarette smoke, and low conversation. A small radio sits on a table, its dials carefully marked, its aerial coiled to avoid detection. Someone copies notes by hand, turning information into something that can move through the networks the group is building. Someone else edits a leaflet intended to expose the regime's lies, short, simple sentences that could land every person in the room in a Gestapo cell if discovered. The walls feel closer than they should, not because the room is small, but because secrecy compresses everything inside it. Even a loose floorboard becomes a risk. And yet the people here continue their work with a steadiness that borders on quiet defiance. This is the world of the Rote Kapelle, the Red Orchestra. The name itself was born from mockery, coined by German counterintelligence to describe what they believed was a coordinated Soviet spy ring, a network of instrument players sending coded signals to Moscow. Reality was far more complex. The so-called orchestra was not a single organization, but a constellation of independent resistance groups scattered across Germany, France, Belgium, and beyond. Some members did pass information to the Soviets, others focused on moral opposition, anti-Nazi leaflets, or documenting crimes for a future reckoning. Many had never heard the term Rote Kapelle until the Gestapo placed it on their arrest notices. But the label stuck, and history would come to use it as shorthand for a remarkable, multifaceted resistance effort. You move through the rooms where these efforts began, noticing how ordinary they seem at first glance. A typewriter sits angled away from the window, so no one can see what is being written. A stack of banned books rests behind a row of permitted ones. A bicycle leans against a wall, ready for a courier route across the city. In another apartment, sketches and photographs lie spread across a table, images meant for clandestine distribution to foreign contacts, evidence meant to show the outside world what the inside of Germany can no longer say openly. These are not spaces shaped for heroism. They are shaped for action, carried out quietly, and with the constant awareness that the wrong sound at the wrong moment could end all of it. The people involved in this growing network do not think of themselves as future martyrs or historical figures. They think of themselves as Germans who have a responsibility that outweighs their fear. Harro Schulze-Boysen enters this story as a young Luftwaffe officer with access to information the regime desperately wants to keep hidden. His wife Libertas brings creative skill and courage that help the network communicate ideas with precision. Arvid and Mildred Harnack, moving between academic and diplomatic circles, use their positions to gather intelligence and maintain contact with foreign allies. Around them spin dozens of others: messengers, translators, artists, idealists, each adding a layer of resilience and vulnerability to the whole. Your perspective moves into the rhythm of their work. Meetings held under pretexts, coded phone calls disguised as routine inquiries, handwritten notes burned immediately after reading, microfilms concealed inside everyday objects. The city around them watches. It always watches. The Gestapo refines its methods, building files, tracing whispers, mapping connections. Every action taken by the resistance requires twice as much caution, twice as much restraint. And yet, even as pressure tightens, the network continues to grow. The belief that truth must survive becomes stronger than the fear of being caught. By the early years of the war, these independent circles, unaware that German intelligence has lumped them together under a single name, have begun to function like veins feeding the same heart. Their motivations differ, their politics vary, but their clarity of purpose is the same. They oppose tyranny. They tell the truth when truth has been made illegal. They try to alert the world to dangers unfolding inside the borders of a country that claims absolute loyalty. If the orchestra metaphor fits at all, it fits here, not as an insult, but as a reminder that separate instruments can create a stronger sound when they carry the same tune. As you move back out into the Berlin night, the quiet feels different than before. It is no longer the silence of a population held in fear. It is the silence that precedes a turning point, even if only a small one. The Rote Kapelle will face immense danger. Many of its members will not survive the years to come. But in these early moments, before the Gestapo's net tightens and before the name Red Orchestra becomes a sentence, their work is defined by possibility. They are shaping pathways for truth to travel, fragile, hidden, fiercely protected. And from this hidden beginning, their story unfolds. Seeds of dissent in a watching nation. The story of the Rote Kapelle begins long before the Gestapo files, the coded transmissions, and the network maps scrawled across intelligence office walls. It begins in the quiet spaces where people start to notice the shape of their own country changing. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Berlin still carries the remnants of a restless, creative era, a place where new ideas clash, political theories spill across cafes, and students argue fiercely about the future of Europe. You move through these rooms as they once were, before fear seeped into them. Warm lights, crowded tables, voices rising not in secrecy but in debate. These early years matter because they show how resistance did not suddenly appear. It grew from earlier habits of curiosity, disagreement, and moral scrutiny. Harro Schulze-Boysen enters this atmosphere as a young man full of intellectual ambition. Before he becomes a figure of resistance, he is a student shaped by literature, philosophy, and a belief that ideas carry weight. He reads widely, engages deeply, and keeps company with artists and writers who push him to think critically about the direction Germany is moving. Even then, with nationalism gaining traction and the political climate tightening, he senses something dangerous in the rhetoric spreading through public spaces. His early writings criticize authoritarian impulses and warn against the rise of a society built on obedience rather than thought. You observe him at a desk scattered with papers, the ink on his notes still fresh. His ideas form the earliest threads of what will later become a network, threads spun long before he imagines the kind of risk they will entail. Not far from Harro's world, Arvid Harnack moves along a different intellectual path. He is more reserved, analytical, shaped by academic rigor and a deep interest in economics and political theory. His studies take him abroad, where he sees alternatives to the tightening German system. When he returns, the contrast is unmistakable. Germany is changing quickly, dissent is becoming dangerous, and the space for free inquiry shrinks each month. You catch a glimpse of him adjusting books on a shelf, volumes on law, political economy, and democratic systems, each one a reminder that he has seen how other nations function. His growing concern is not dramatic. It builds slowly, shaped by observation rather than outrage. But that concern will eventually place him at the center of one of the most remarkable resistance networks the war will produce. Standing beside Arvid is Mildred Harnack, an American scholar whose presence adds perspective the regime cannot easily contain. Her distance from German nationalism gives her clarity, and her experiences in the United States make her sensitive to the distortions spreading through German public life. She teaches, translates, and writes. She moves through academic circles with an attentiveness that picks up early signs of ideology shaping institutions. You follow her through hallways lined with notice boards, some filled with course schedules, others increasingly filled with propaganda. She sees what is coming earlier than many around her, not because she is less German, but because she has seen Germany before it began changing so profoundly. These early personal developments unfold against a national backdrop shifting with alarming speed. As the Nazi Party consolidates power, systems of surveillance grow around ordinary life. The Gestapo expands its reach through networks of informants and carefully engineered fear. Postal censorship intensifies. Radio ownership becomes monitored. Public institutions transform into instruments of ideological control. You observe these structural changes with an investigative calm, a clerk adjusting stamps in a censorship office, a uniformed man scanning a list of permitted broadcasts, a teacher quietly removing a banned book from a classroom shelf before a supervisor arrives. None of these actions look dramatic, yet each contributes to the environment that will later define the Rote-Capelle's work. Resistance is not born in a vacuum. It is shaped by the pressures applied against it. Harro continues his intellectual explorations as the political atmosphere tightens, and the tone of his conversations changes. His circle, once focused on art and philosophy, begins to speak openly about the dangers of the new regime. But open speech becomes hazardous. Friendships strain under the pressure to conform. Those who disagree with the regime must learn to recognize who they can trust. You watch as Harro scans a room before speaking, adjusting his tone depending on who stands nearby. The shift is subtle but unmistakable. Ideas that once flowed freely now require caution. This constraint marks the beginning of his transition from critic to dissident. Arvid's path evolves in parallel. His work in the Ministry of Economics grants him access to information that reveals the regime's ambitions more clearly than public speeches ever could. He sees the militarization deepening, the economic manipulations guiding the country toward war, and the ideological purity expected within bureaucratic circles. His concern is not fueled by idealism alone, but by evidence, data, reports, memoranda. You follow him into an office late at night, charts spread across a desk, the faint scratch of a pencil marking troubling trends. Arvid does not speak dramatically. He simply understands that what he sees is incompatible with the future he believes Germany deserves. The surveillance apparatus around them strengthens by the month. Posters encourage citizens to report suspicious behavior. Neighbors watch one another more closely. The police gain new powers of detention. The Gestapo's presence becomes both visible and invisible, visible in uniforms and raids, invisible in the uncertainty of who might be listening. You move through a Berlin train station where travelers lower their voices instinctively, not knowing who stands within earshot. Fear becomes a quiet undertone to everyday life, shaping decisions large and small. For people like the Harnacks and Schulze-Boysens, this environment does not silence them, it sharpens their resolve. Libertas Schulze-Boysen, Harro's wife, adds another dimension to this growing resistance. Her creativity and connections within cultural circles give her insight into how propaganda shapes the public imagination. She sees how films, exhibitions, and publications subtly shift the boundaries of acceptable thought. You watch her reviewing photographs and articles with a critical eye, aware of how narratives can be crafted to hide or reveal truth. Her awareness becomes a tool, one she will later use to help distribute anti-Nazi material designed to cut through the fog of propaganda surrounding the German population. By the mid-1930s, these individuals, still not yet part of any organized resistance, carry the seeds of what will eventually become the Rote Kapelle. Their motivations differ, their backgrounds diverge, but they share a developing conviction that silence is no longer acceptable. The nation around them is becoming more disciplined, more silent, more dangerous. They understand that opposition in this new Germany must be deliberate, careful, and informed. As you step back from these early scenes, the pattern becomes clearer. The Rote Kapelle did not emerge suddenly in response to war. It grew gradually from the lives of people who watched their country change and refused to surrender their principles. They did not yet know how their paths would converge or what risks they would eventually face, but they were already becoming the type of people who would act when action became unavoidable. The first quiet connections. The late 1930s bring the first faint signs that the strands of dissent forming across Berlin might eventually intersect. These individuals, Harro, Arvid, Mildred, Libertas, do not yet speak of resistance networks or clandestine operations, but the conditions around them push their paths closer. Berlin's intellectual circles grow smaller as independent thinkers are silenced or exiled. University halls lose their liveliness, replaced by uniformity and political conformity. Cultural venues shift their programming to align with state ideology. It becomes harder for people with critical minds to avoid encountering one another, if only because the shrinking space forces them toward the same surviving pockets of thought. You move through one such pocket, a private gathering in a modest apartment where friends, colleagues, and acquaintances discuss books, foreign news, and the increasingly narrow boundaries of public discourse. The group is diverse in background but unified in concern. The conversations are careful, shaped by glances toward the door and pauses before speaking. Harro attends occasionally, bringing with him the energy of someone who refuses to accept intellectual stagnation. Arvid's presence is quieter but no less significant. He listens more than he speaks, gauging which people might one day be trusted. No one in the room uses the word resistance. They are simply trying to preserve the ability to think freely. But this is how resistance begins, not with declarations, but with the preservation of independent thought under pressure. Outside these small gatherings, the machinery of the Nazi state expands relentlessly. The Gestapo's methods grow more sophisticated, fed by a network of informants incentivized through fear, loyalty, or personal advantage. Surveillance becomes less about targeting known dissidents and more about preventing dissent from forming at all. Offices implement political vetting for promotions. Schools evaluate teachers on ideological conformity. Workplace conversations become potential liabilities. You observe a clerk quietly removing a personal letter from his desk as a uniformed supervisor approaches, an instinctive act that reflects how deeply surveillance has penetrated daily life. The state no longer needs to monitor everyone directly. It simply needs people to believe they are being watched. Harro's transformation accelerates during these years. His early criticisms of authoritarianism turn into an urgent private conviction that the country is being led toward catastrophe. He witnesses the tightening grip of the regime from within military circles, where he gains insights into strategic intentions and internal power dynamics. You watch him reviewing a document in his office, closing it carefully when footsteps pass in the hallway. He knows that his rank and position give him access the regime expects him to use loyally. Instead, he begins to see it as a responsibility. Information is now a tool that could be used against the system if handled correctly. This is not yet espionage, but it is the beginnings of a mindset that will make espionage possible. Arvid and Mildred feel the pressure from a different angle. Their academic and professional circles shrink as colleagues disappear, some dismissed, others emigrating, some simply falling silent. The Harnacks respond by creating informal study groups that continue to explore banned authors and foreign perspectives. These meetings are small, often only a handful of participants, but they preserve a space where ideas can breathe. You follow Mildred preparing tea for a discussion, her gestures calm but deliberate. The group's conversations increasingly shift from academic theory to the moral implications of the shifting political landscape. They do not yet speak of action, but they are preparing themselves for the decisions that action will require. By 1937 to 1938, the regime's intrusions reached deeper into cultural and personal life. Art, music, and cinema become tools of propaganda. Libertas Schulze-Boysen observes these changes with growing frustration. Her work in film and photography exposes her to the mechanisms the regime uses to shape perception: selective framing, emotional manipulation, strategically curated imagery. You watch her evaluating a new propaganda brochure, her expression tightening as she recognizes the subtle distortions woven into each image. Her understanding of how narratives are constructed and how they can be subverted will later become essential to the resistance's ability to communicate truth. International tension adds urgency to their concerns. News from abroad becomes distorted through state-controlled channels. Foreign publications are increasingly banned. The average citizen receives only the version of events the regime approves. But Arvid, through his position in the Ministry of Economics, has access to reports that reveal far more ambitious and dangerous intentions. You step into his office as he reads a document detailing increased military production, its implications unmistakable. He understands that Germany is preparing for conflict on a scale that will devastate Europe. The question he faces is no longer whether the regime is dangerous, but how much time remains before danger becomes catastrophe. Harro and Arvid's circles begin to intersect not through design, but through shared acquaintances, common concerns, and the narrowing spaces where independent thinkers can safely meet. A friend invites Harro to a discussion group also attended by the Harnacks. Another invites the Harnacks to an apartment gathering where Harro happens to be present. These accidental overlaps are small, but they matter. You follow these early encounters, noting how each person watches the others, evaluating not what they say but how they say it. Trust in these circles grows slowly, carefully. The cost of misjudgment is simply too high. It is during these same years that the first small acts of dissent begin to take shape. Someone distributes anonymous leaflets criticizing the regime. Another translates foreign news summaries to share with trusted friends. A small group collects testimonies about early abuses. None of these actions are coordinated, and none are yet connected to any broader organization. But the effect is cumulative. People who oppose the regime begin to recognize each other, indirectly and discreetly. A subtle network forms long before anyone attempts to formalize it. The tightening surveillance state accelerates this process. As public dissent becomes nearly impossible, meaningful dissent can exist only in private, and private spaces become crucibles where resistance is quietly refined. You observe Mildred making careful notes on foreign economic reports. You observe Harro lowering his voice when discussing political matters with trusted friends. You observe Libertas examining photographs that reveal inconsistencies in the regime's messaging. Each of these actions reflects a shift from concern to preparation. Preparation not yet for open resistance, but for the possibility of one day acting. The regime's escalating aggression, first internal, then external, pushes these individuals closer to that threshold. The annexation of Austria, the pressures on Czechoslovakia, the rising militarism, each event confirms the path Germany is taking. The people who will eventually form the core of the Rote Kapelle understand that they are not dealing with a temporary political movement, but with a system that intends to reshape Europe through force. You see this understanding settle over them not as panic, but as resolve. They do not yet know how they will resist, but they know that silence will no longer suffice. As Chapter 1 draws to a close, these individuals still live separate lives. They attend different gatherings, pursue different careers, and maintain different social circles. But the forces shaping their environment, fear, censorship, propaganda, militarization, press them toward the same conclusion: the regime cannot be opposed alone. If resistance is to be possible, it will require connection, trust, and the willingness to share risk. You step back into the Berlin night with that understanding. The city is still quiet, but it is no longer the quiet of passive acceptance. Within apartments, offices, and lecture halls, the first connections have begun to form, faint, fragile, and dangerous. The people who will one day act together do not yet realize it, but their steps have already begun to converge. Soon, the network that history will call the Rote Kapelle will emerge from this convergence, shaped by the personal histories, moral convictions, and quiet courage of those who refuse to surrender their minds to a watching nation. Circles begin to merge. By the end of the 1930s, Berlin has become a city where dissent moves almost entirely indoors. Public squares, once alive with competing political voices, now echo with orchestrated parades and carefully choreographed displays of loyalty. Newspapers repeat the same narratives. Radio broadcasts shift from entertainment to instruction. Conversations become shorter, thinner, safer. And in this tightening environment, small pockets of people who refuse to surrender their own judgment begin to find one another. You follow these crossings carefully, watching how people who once seemed unrelated begin to inhabit the same rooms, exchange the same wary glances, and recognize a shared unease that soon becomes a shared purpose. Harro Schulze-Boysen's apartment becomes one such meeting place. It is not advertised, not planned, and not even intended as the nucleus of anything organized. It simply becomes a room where people can talk without lowering their voices to whispers. Many arrive through personal connections, friends of friends, colleagues of trusted acquaintances, or people who have quietly demonstrated that they can be spoken to safely. You step into the room as Harro hosts a discussion about a foreign newspaper article someone has managed to obtain. The participants sit close, partly because the apartment is small and partly because proximity feels safer. They speak cautiously at first, then more openly as they gauge one another's reliability. No one records names. No one asks too many questions. But the atmosphere carries a sense of purpose. These gatherings are not just conversations. They are rehearsals for action. The participants in these meetings come from varied backgrounds. Some are artists frustrated by the regime's growing control over cultural expression. Others are journalists whose work has been restricted to narrow ideological boundaries. A few come from government positions, uneasy with what they see behind closed doors. You watch each person contribute fragments of information, a rumor about an internal conflict within the party, a hint of military preparations, a report about censorship tightening in a specific department. None of the fragments alone reveal much. But Harro sees patterns, and so do others in the room. They understand that information, when shared, becomes something more than the sum of its parts. Parallel to these gatherings, the Harnacks maintain their own circle, one grounded more in academic rigor and international perspective. Arvid and Mildred host reading groups that examine banned authors, foreign political systems, and economic trends that contradict the regime's narrative. These meetings begin as intellectual exploration, but gradually shift toward strategic thought. Participants discuss not just ideas but implications. What does Germany's economic direction indicate about future intentions? What does the removal of certain officials suggest about internal tensions? Where are the regime's vulnerabilities? Legal, administrative, psychological? You follow Mildred as she arranges chairs for a meeting, preparing a space where people can think clearly even when clarity carries risk. The overlap between these two circles happens gradually. A journalist from Harro's group meets an academic from the Harnack circle, then recommends a friend attend one of their discussions. A translator from Mildred's world brings foreign news summaries to Harro's gatherings. Someone mentions that Arvid would be interested in a particular document. Someone else notes that Harro has contacts who can verify a rumor. These connections are not yet coordinated, but they form the early architecture of a network whose strength will eventually lie in its diversity. You observe these early interactions with attention to detail, the careful introductions, the tentative exchanges, the quiet relief when someone realizes they are speaking to another person who sees the world clearly. The environment around them pushes these circles closer still. As Germany edges into open aggression, annexations, ultimatums, mobilization, the question in these rooms shifts from what is happening to what should we do. Harro speaks more frequently about the moral responsibility of those who have access to information the public does not. Arvid emphasizes the need for accurate analysis that can counter propaganda. Mildred highlights the human cost of silence, drawing from her experiences with students who no longer feel free to express their own thoughts. Libertas, with her keen understanding of visual messaging, begins experimenting with ways to communicate truth through images rather than words, knowing that images can sometimes slip past censors where text cannot. These shifts are not dramatic. They unfold slowly, shaped by countless small discussions. But you see the transformation taking place. The people in these circles no longer gather merely to understand their world. They gather to consider how they might influence it. They are not yet a resistance group, not yet a spy network, not yet a target of the Gestapo's investigations. But they are no longer passive observers either. Their conversations begin to take on a sense of trajectory. The unity forming between these circles is strengthened further by the war's outbreak in 1939. The initial wave of patriotic fervor sweeps across the country, but inside these apartments the mood is markedly different. They understand the cost of the conflict Germany has initiated. They know the war is not defensive but expansionist, driven by ideology rather than necessity. You observe Mildred reading foreign reports about civilian suffering, Arvid marking economic projections that indicate prolonged conflict, Harro quietly expressing fear about what militarization will mean for Germany's future. Their views, once cautious, now sharpen into opposition. War also creates new opportunities for access to information. Harro's position inside the Luftwaffe grants him insight into military plans, internal communications, and the regime's strategic anxieties. Arvid's work in the Ministry of Economics gives him an understanding of the economic pressure points that could shape the war's trajectory. Libertas continues to monitor shifts in propaganda. Mildred follows international reactions. You watch each of them gather information through the natural course of their professional lives, information that, collectively, becomes invaluable. Yet even as these individuals grow more certain of their opposition, they maintain a careful awareness of the risks. The Gestapo's intelligence apparatus expands alongside the war effort, with new departments dedicated to countering espionage and dissident activity. Informants become more active. Random checks become more frequent. Offices require new loyalty oaths. You observe a worker hurriedly hiding a foreign newspaper as inspectors begin a sweep of a government building. The message is clear. resistance must be conducted with precision, caution, and trust. Trust, in turn, becomes the central element shaping the merging circles. The people involved learn to evaluate reliability not through grand gestures but through consistency, small signs of courage, discretion, clarity, and judgment. Trust deepens through shared risk. A dangerous conversation held in a stairwell, a document passed hand to hand, a moment of honesty in a room where everyone is choosing their words carefully. You see these bonds forming almost invisibly, yet they become the foundation on which the Red Orchestra will later rely. By late 1939 and early 1940, the two circles, Harro's and the Harnacks, begin to operate with an increasing degree of cooperation. They exchange information discreetly. They compare insights. They coordinate the distribution of certain controlled materials, including leaflets meant to provide alternative narratives to the regime's propaganda. They begin to map out ways to gather more substantial intelligence, not yet fully aware that this work will soon draw them into a larger European network of resistance, espionage, and daring moral action. As Part A closes, you step back from these early convergences and see the structure beginning to form. It is fragile, informal, and hidden, but it is unmistakably moving toward something larger. The individuals who once gathered to share concerns are now beginning to act with intent. Their circles are no longer separate. They are slowly forming the edges of a clandestine network that will challenge one of the most powerful regimes in history, not through force, but through truth. First steps toward an organized network. As the 1940s unfold, the informal conversations and cautious exchanges that once defined these circles begin to coalesce into something more deliberate. It doesn't happen through a manifesto or a formal decision. No one gathers the group and declares they are now a resistance organization. The shift occurs in quieter ways, in the questions people ask, the documents they share, the responsibilities they assume without discussing them openly. You observe these subtleties in the rooms where they meet. Fewer speculative debates, more concrete planning. Fewer theoretical discussions, more questions that begin with "how can we?" and "what would it take to?" As their understanding deepens, so does their sense of obligation. Harro Schulze-Boysen becomes increasingly central to this quiet transition. His military position grants him access to documents most Germans will never see. At first, he shares only fragments, carefully selected pieces that reveal the regime's intentions without exposing himself. But over time, he realizes that fragments alone are insufficient. The reality of what he sees, the scale of planned aggression, the disregard for human life, the willingness to manipulate truth, demands a more active response. You watch him sorting files late at night, identifying which pieces of information carry strategic significance and which could help people outside the regime understand what is happening within. He is aware that mishandling even a single document could cost him his life, yet he persists with calm, deliberate care. In parallel, Arvid Harnack refines his own approach to gathering information. His economic analyses reveal vulnerabilities in the regime's war planning, and he understands that accurate insight into these vulnerabilities could one day help those who oppose Nazi expansion. He begins to keep detailed notes, not just about what he learns, but about how different departments interact, who holds influence, and where blind spots exist within the system. You observe him making these notes in a shorthand only he fully understands, storing them in places unlikely to attract attention. His work is not dramatic, but it is precise, and precision is what resistance requires. Mildred and Libertas complement these efforts in ways that are less technical but equally essential. Mildred maintains connections to foreign intellectual and diplomatic circles, offering perspectives unavailable through German media. She reads widely, translating foreign articles when necessary, and circulates summaries to trusted individuals. You watch her preparing these summaries with careful phrasing, enough clarity to illuminate the truth, but not enough to endanger those who read them. Libertas, meanwhile, brings creative insight to the group's communication strategies. She understands how imagery shapes perception and begins experimenting with ways to undermine propaganda through subtle visual counternarratives. Her work is not yet distribution on a mass scale, but she is laying the groundwork for future leaflets, pamphlets, and photographic evidence. As their efforts become more coordinated, new people begin to enter the circle. Some arrive through academic channels, others through artistic communities, and others still through professional government positions. Each person brings skills the group did not previously have. A printer with access to specialized equipment offers his help. A linguist capable of translating foreign broadcasts becomes invaluable. A clerk within a government office quietly passes along documents that reveal hidden policies. You watch these individuals being assessed with care. Trust is not given lightly. Each new member undergoes an unspoken evaluation. Demeanor, consistency, discretion, the ability to remain composed under pressure. Only those who demonstrate reliability become part of the core. The early methods of communication within this growing network reflect the environment they navigate. They cannot rely on open discussion, so they develop ways to share information discreetly. Some methods are simple: a phrase inserted into an ordinary letter, a small mark on a doorframe indicating the safety of a meeting location, a book placed on a shelf at a prearranged angle. Others are more sophisticated: coded notes using substitution systems, messages hidden within everyday objects, and carefully timed handovers in public spaces where watchers are less likely to notice. You follow a courier as he carries a folded paper concealed beneath the lining of his coat. An ordinary walk down an ordinary street, yet it carries immense risk. The group's early leaflets emerge during this period as well. They are short, direct, and intentionally plain in appearance. Their purpose is not to inspire rebellion through dramatic rhetoric, but to pierce the fog of propaganda with truth. They criticize government actions, expose false claims, and warn about the consequences of militarism. The goal is simple: encourage people to think. You watch Libertas and a small team preparing the leaflets late at night, working quickly and quietly. They know the danger. They also know the importance. Each leaflet represents a challenge to the regime's monopoly on information, a reminder that truth still exists outside official channels. The regime's tightening grip only sharpens the network's resolve. As military victories accumulate and nationalistic fervor strengthens, the group understands that opposition must become more coordinated. Public support for the war grows, fueled by propaganda and early battlefield successes. But inside these rooms, the mood is somber. Harro, Arvid, Mildred, and Libertas see the consequences of the regime's ambitions far more clearly than most citizens. They know the direction Germany is heading, and they understand that the longer the regime remains unchallenged, the more devastating the eventual outcome will be. The first steps toward direct contact with foreign powers begin here as well. Some individuals in the network believe that the only effective resistance is that which can influence Germany's strategic trajectory, and that such influence requires external support. You observe preliminary discussions about whether it is possible, or wise, to share information with foreign governments hostile to the Nazi regime. These conversations are cautious, shaped by both practical concerns and moral considerations. Some fear that such contact could be seen as treason. Others argue that failing to act in the face of such danger is a greater betrayal. These tensions do not divide the group. Rather, they refine their strategy. They recognize that resistance requires multiple layers: internal opposition, truth-telling through leaflets and publications, and carefully controlled channels that might one day carry crucial intelligence abroad. They understand that no single method will be enough. They must work on all fronts, each effort reinforcing the others. It is during this phase that the network acquires the first characteristics of an intelligence organization. Not a formal one, no hierarchy, no uniforms, no written codes, but a functional one built on shared purpose. Information is identified, evaluated, categorized, and transmitted. Risks are assessed. Meetings are coordinated. Responsibilities are distributed according to skill and temperament. You witness this evolution not through dramatic decisions, but through dozens of small choices. Who receives which updates, who carries which documents, who attends which meeting. The system is fluid, adaptable, and discrete. By the end of Chapter 2, a loose but functional network exists. It is not yet the rote Kapelle, as the Gestapo will describe it in its files, nor the integrated European resistance network it will later become. But it is no longer simply a collection of concerned individuals. It is a deliberate effort to expose truth, challenge falsehood, gather information, and prepare for the possibility of deeper action. You step back and see how far they have already come, how the small conversations of the early 1930s have transformed into a coordinated, quietly determined network ready to confront a regime that dominates nearly every aspect of German life. Their path forward will grow more dangerous, more complex, and more consequential. But the foundation is set. Signals in the shadows. By 1940, the group that once met to exchange ideas now begins to move with a new sense of purpose. The war has expanded, swallowing borders and dragging millions into its orbit. Everywhere in Germany, the regime's confidence grows. Victories in Western Europe reinforce the illusion of invincibility, and propaganda intensifies. In this atmosphere of triumphalism, the quiet rooms where the resistance gathers feel increasingly isolated. Yet isolation does not weaken them. It sharpens their focus. They understand that the more confident the regime becomes, the more urgently truth must travel where the state refuses to send it. You enter a dim apartment where Harro Schulze-Boysen sits with several trusted members of the group. Their discussions are no longer philosophical. They revolve around logistics, communication, and security. Harro outlines the types of information he can access through his position in military intelligence. He explains which documents can be copied, which can only be memorized, and which carry a risk too great to touch directly. The others listen closely, evaluating not just the content but the implications. For the first time, they begin to think in systems. How information flows, how it can be transmitted, how to protect those who carry it. At the same time, Arvid Harnack refines his own approach to intelligence gathering. His access to economic and administrative data allows him to see how the war strains Germany's resources. He notices patterns in production, supply, and labor allocation that hint at the regime's long-term strategy. You watch him marking key points in a ledger, noting where shortages might reveal future military targets or where production bottlenecks might weaken the war effort. He understands that intelligence is not only about troop movements or political negotiations. It is also about the economic underpinnings that sustain the regime's ambitions. The two threads, military intelligence from Harro and economic intelligence from Arvid, begin to complement each other. Their combined insights form a clearer picture of the war than any single member of the group could produce alone. You watch them meet discreetly at a park bench, exchanging notes in conversation rather than handing over documents. They sit casually, as two colleagues discussing routine matters, but the information they share shapes the core of what the network will soon transmit beyond Germany's borders. Clandestine communication becomes essential at this stage. The group experiments with methods that minimize risk while maximizing reliability. Handwritten notes are coded using substitution ciphers, simple but effective if handled carefully. More complex messages are hidden within seemingly ordinary letters. A pattern of misplaced punctuation, an unusual capitalization, a sentence whose meaning shifts when read diagonally. You follow one such letter from Mildred's hands to a courier's coat pocket. It looks harmless, indistinguishable from dozens of others passing through the postal system. Yet within its lines lies information the regime would consider treasonous. The network also begins to use couriers more frequently. These couriers are not professionals, but trusted contacts who understand the stakes. They travel by bicycle across Berlin, carry messages tucked into book bindings, or deliver notes under the pretext of visiting friends. Their routes are planned to avoid patterns. Their deliveries occur in places where surveillance is less intense: markets, trams, crowded cafes. You observe one courier sitting calmly on a bench, waiting for a predetermined signal before passing a folded paper to another member of the group. The exchange lasts seconds, unnoticed by anyone nearby. Foreign contact emerges as a possibility during this period, though it is not yet fully formed. Arvid, whose academic background includes time in the United States, maintains connections that could potentially carry intelligence beyond Germany. Harro explores the idea of indirect communication channels through intermediaries in France, Belgium, or Switzerland. These considerations are tentative. The consequences of discovery are catastrophic. Yet the group understands that the scale of the regime's danger extends far beyond Germany's borders. They begin to consider the responsibility not just to their own nation but to the broader world. The group's internal communication evolves as well. Meetings become smaller, more selective. Information is compartmentalized so that no single member carries unnecessary risk. Trusted individuals oversee specific tasks: copying documents, analyzing economic data, distributing leaflets, handling foreign summaries. You enter a candlelit room where Libertas reviews photographs intended to accompany future leaflets. She evaluates each image not for artistic value, but for its ability to reveal truth without betraying its source. Her understanding of visual messaging becomes increasingly important as the group looks for ways to communicate under heavy censorship. At the same time, Mildred expands her network among foreign students and expatriates still living in Germany. She gathers news from abroad, translating and summarizing articles that would never appear in German newspapers. These summaries circulate quietly among the group, providing a broader perspective on the war. You watch her reading a foreign report that contradicts German propaganda about events in Poland. She translates it carefully, ensuring that its meaning is preserved even when its phrasing must be softened for safety. The group's methods are not flawless. Mistakes occur. A courier arrives late, raising concern that he may have been followed. A coded message takes too long to reach its recipient. A meeting is postponed because someone notices unfamiliar faces lingering near the building entrance. You observe these moments as small jolts in the network, signs of the risk they navigate daily. But each mistake becomes a lesson. Procedures are refined, security improves, caution deepens. Their resilience comes not from perfection, but from adaptation. The group also begins to collect evidence of atrocities. Reports of crimes committed in occupied territories reach them through indirect channels: letters, whispered testimonies, stray documents. They understand that exposing these crimes to the outside world is as important as revealing military plans. Truth, in their hands, becomes a moral weapon. You watch Arvid reviewing a report about forced labor conditions, his expression shifting from analytical to grave. He knows this information must move beyond this room, even if doing so accelerates the danger closing around the group. By the midpoint of Chapter 3, the network has taken its first real steps into clandestine work. They are no longer simply exchanging information. They are collecting it, interpreting it, encoding it, and preparing it for transmission beyond the borders of Nazi Germany. The transformation is quiet but decisive. Their roles have changed from observers to operatives, and they navigate this new reality with a mix of determination and unease. You step back and see the pattern taking shape. Nodes of information, connected by trust, moving under the radar of one of the most sophisticated surveillance states in history. The risks are immense, but the group is driven by a belief stronger than fear, the belief that truth can still alter the course of events. Building the hidden arteries of espionage. As 1940 progresses, the network's work begins to resemble something far more structured than its origins. Their information no longer circulates casually. It is evaluated, prioritized, and prepared with a sense of strategic purpose. The people involved still consider themselves ordinary citizens acting from moral necessity, yet their methods increasingly resemble those of a clandestine intelligence service. You step into this evolution carefully, watching how each decision adds another layer of depth and danger to their operation. One of the earliest signs of this shift is the group's experimentation with radio communication. Shortwave radios had long been a means of accessing foreign broadcasts, but now the possibility arises. Could they transmit as well as receive? The idea is ambitious. Germany maintains strict control over radio frequencies, and unauthorized transmissions are a direct threat to state security. Still, some technically skilled members argue that short, well-timed signals could slip past detection. You follow them into a cramped room where a small transmitter is being tested. Its components are minimal, improvised from parts purchased separately to avoid suspicion. The operators speak softly as they adjust dials and check frequencies. Their calmness masks the reality that a single miscalculation could bring the Gestapo to the door. The early tests are cautious. Short bursts of signal, coded in simple sequences, are sent into the night. No one expects a direct reply. The purpose is to see whether they can transmit without attracting attention. You observe the tension as they wait for signs of detection. Vehicles stopping outside, sudden knocks on the door, or the subtle disruptions that indicate monitoring equipment nearby. Nothing happens. The silence is almost unsettling. They do not yet know whether their signal reached anyone, but the test proves something important. Transmission is possible. Parallel to these radio experiments, the group intensifies its courier system inside Berlin. Couriers now follow structured protocols, alternating routes, mismatched timing between sender and receiver, and deliberate misdirection to avoid creating recognizable patterns. Messages are divided when necessary, half carried by one courier, half by another, ensuring that no single interception can reveal too much. You observe a courier placing a folded slip of paper behind a loose brick near a public fountain, then walking away without looking back. Hours later, another member retrieves it with equal calm. This system, improvised yet effective, becomes one of the network's most reliable arteries. Meanwhile, the question of foreign contact begins to crystallize. Many in the group believe that Germany's internal opposition cannot alter the course of the war alone. The regime's power is too entrenched, its surveillance too pervasive. They need allies outside the country, individuals or governments who can receive intelligence, amplify truth, and potentially intervene. You watch the debates unfold in quiet apartments. Should they approach Western powers? Should they risk attempting contact with the Soviet Union? Each option carries moral complexity and strategic risk. They know that any attempt to reach out could be interpreted as treason. Yet they also believe that neutrality in the face of such danger would be a greater betrayal. Arvid's previous academic connections to American diplomats give the group a potential pathway to the United States, though this channel is far from secure. Harro, meanwhile, sees advantages in reaching the Soviets, not because he shares their ideology, but because they are one of the regime's primary adversaries and might act on credible intelligence. The group debates this quietly, understanding the weight of the decision. They do not see themselves as ideological tools of any foreign government. Their allegiance is to truth and to the hope that Germany's descent into catastrophe might still be halted. The eventual decision is not unanimous, but it is measured. They will attempt to transmit limited intelligence to foreign powers, carefully controlled and evaluated to avoid compromising sources or appearing as if they act under external direction. They believe that sending information about Germany's military intentions could save lives, not only abroad but within Germany itself, by hastening the regime's defeat. You observe this decision as a point of no return. Once they cross into active espionage, the Gestapo will no longer view them as dissidents. They will be enemies of the state. With this decision comes the refinement of tradecraft. The group formalizes rules that had previously existed only as instinct. Never carry documents you do not need. Speak only in controlled environments, never spontaneously. Use indirect terms even in private discussions. Treat every meeting as though it is under observation. Assume that anyone could be pressured into revealing information. Destroy anything that could betray the structure of the network. You see the effect immediately. Members become quieter, more deliberate. The way they arrange a table, choose a cafe, or walk a street reflects new awareness. They no longer move through Berlin as ordinary citizens. They move as people who understand that every step might be watched. One of the most delicate tasks in this period is the copying of classified documents. Harro, with access to military files, cannot simply remove them from secure rooms. Instead, he memorizes critical details or recreates documents by hand during off hours. You watch him standing at a desk after his colleagues have gone home, drawing diagrams, rewriting paragraphs, sketching maps from memory. His calmness belies the risk. If even a single sheet of paper is discovered out of place, surveillance will intensify, and his life could unravel in hours. Arvid's methods are equally careful. He focuses on economic intelligence that reveals Germany's long-term plans, industrial allocations, raw material shortages, and internal disputes over resource management. He understands that these patterns, when viewed broadly, reveal far more than any single document. The information he extracts often appears mundane: production figures, shipping schedules, requisition forms. But he sees through the details to the strategy beneath. You observe him distilling these insights into concise summaries the network can use. The group's leaflets continue as well, evolving in style and tone. The early versions were simple critiques. The new versions carry sharper clarity and more strategic intent. Some describe the brutality of the occupation forces. Others expose the regime's failures. A few encourage passive resistance through small acts that undermine ideological control. You watch Libertas editing one such leaflet, removing any phrasing that could reveal its origin. The goal is not to claim authorship, but to spread truth anonymously, letting it circulate like a quiet current beneath the surface of public life. As the group's activities expand, so do the risks. There are moments of fear. A courier followed for several blocks, an unexpected inspection at a government office, a missing member who eventually reappears with an explanation that is plausible but not entirely reassuring. You observe how the network handles these jolts, by tightening procedures, reducing contact, and acting with increased discipline. Fear becomes a tool rather than an obstacle, sharpening their awareness rather than paralyzing them. The group also begins to understand something profound. Effective resistance requires emotional resilience. They cannot afford panic, misplaced trust, or uncontrolled anger. You watch them cultivating a kind of quiet steadiness, an internal discipline that allows them to carry out dangerous tasks with calm precision. They become experts not only in tradecraft, but in managing their own fear. By the end of this chapter, the network possesses the early structure of a true clandestine organization: systems of communication, defined roles, emerging foreign contacts, refined secrecy protocols, and a growing stream of intelligence ready for transmission. They have stepped fully into the shadows, guided not by ideology, but by a belief in truth and human dignity. You step back from this scene understanding clearly. The Red Orchestra is no longer a possibility. It is becoming a reality. The net begins to tighten. By early 1941, the atmosphere in Berlin changes in ways that are difficult to describe at first glance. The streets are the same, the uniforms the same, the propaganda slogans the same. But beneath the surface, a new layer of vigilance settles over the city. The war is expanding. The stakes are rising. And the state grows more attentive to the possibility of hidden dissent. You move through these streets observing their new texture, policemen who watch faces more carefully, clerks who hesitate before stamping documents, neighbors who pause before greeting one another. Trust becomes thinner. Silence becomes thicker. Inside government offices, internal security procedures tighten. Employees are told to report unusual behavior. Colleagues who work late, individuals who request files outside their typical duties, even subtle changes in mood or routine. You enter a corridor where a low-ranking administrator studies a list of new directives posted on a bulletin board. The instructions are framed as necessary wartime precautions, but their implications are clear. Every citizen must become a potential informant, and every worker must treat their environment as a space where loyalty is constantly evaluated. For the members of the Rote Kapelle, this shift is palpable. Their methods, once executed with careful but manageable caution, now require an even higher degree of discipline. Harro Schulze-Boysen notices subtle but significant changes in his workplace. Conversations feel more constrained. Colleagues who once shared offhand remarks about leadership now speak in polished, formulaic phrases. You see him reading memos that emphasize the importance of identifying politically unreliable elements within the ranks. He understands what they are, coded invitations for colleagues to scrutinize one another. Arvid Harnack experiences similar changes in the Ministry of Economics. Meetings become more structured, with fewer opportunities for private conversation. Documents that were once circulated freely now require multiple signatures to access. Even the tone of internal correspondence shifts, becoming more formal and more guarded. You observe Arvid adjusting to this environment with quiet adaptability, modifying his methods for obtaining intelligence. He internalizes more information to avoid generating paper trails. He keeps his analytical notes shorter, disguised within legitimate work. He understands that the landscape has changed, and so must he. Despite these tightening conditions, the network continues to expand its activities. Their intelligence-gathering efforts grow more sophisticated. Their leaflets reach new districts. Their contacts outside Germany become stronger. Yet with each step forward comes an increased sense of vulnerability. The group knows that the Gestapo is not static. It learns, adapts, and evolves. For every method of secrecy the network develops, the regime develops a method of detection. You watch Mildred and Libertas discussing the implications of a recent arrest in another part of Berlin. Although unrelated to their network, the details indicate that the Gestapo is refining its ability to trace clandestine communication. The first close call occurs when a courier does not arrive at a meeting point at the expected time. Hours pass with no sign of him. The group prepares for the worst: interception, interrogation, exposure. You follow Harro as he re-evaluates recent activities, mapping out who met whom, what was exchanged, and what could be compromised. The absence weighs heavily. Yet the courier returns the next morning, pale and shaken but unharmed. He explains that a random checkpoint forced him to alter his route. He acted instinctively, avoiding the meeting point to ensure he did not lead anyone to the others. His caution saved them. But the incident leaves a lasting mark. They realize how fragile their system truly is. Another incident occurs when a coded letter containing foreign summaries is delayed in the postal system. The delay itself is not suspicious. Wartime mail often moves slowly. But the group worries about the possibility that the letter was inspected. You observe them analyzing every detail: the tone of the postal clerk, the condition of the envelope, the timing of recent arrests in the city. Nothing can be confirmed. Yet uncertainty becomes a kind of pressure, shaping their decisions in subtle ways. They reduce written communication. They increase in-person briefings. They adopt new codes. Meanwhile, the Gestapo intensifies its hunt for clandestine radio transmitters. Although none of the group's early experiments have been detected, the risk grows. The regime deploys mobile detection vans capable of triangulating illegal transmissions. You watch one of these vans, a dark vehicle with antennae, moving slowly down a residential street at night, scanning for faint signals. The image lingers in the minds of the network's members. Their radio operators decide to suspend activity for several weeks, believing that survival requires patience as much as courage. The pressure is particularly heavy on those with access to classified documents. Harro knows that the slightest irregularity could trigger scrutiny. You observe him in his office, carefully memorizing key sections of a military report before returning it to its proper place. He never removes documents. He never leaves traces. But he feels the noose tightening. He notices a new officer assigned to internal security, polite, efficient, and watchful. Their interactions are courteous, but the intent behind the officer's presence is unmistakable, to ensure that no one deviates from the expected line. Arvid experiences a similar tightening. A colleague questions him casually about a foreign publication, too casually, perhaps. Another asks him to clarify the purpose of a data request he submitted. These interactions might be harmless, or they might be probes. Arvid answers with composure, but he adjusts his habits immediately afterward, eliminating every unnecessary risk. You watch him shred a set of notes he had intended to analyze later. He cannot afford to keep anything that does not serve an essential function. Despite the escalating danger, the group does not fracture. In fact, the pressure seems to bind them more closely. They refine their selection process for new contacts, tightening the criteria for trust. They develop fallback plans for communication, secondary meeting points, alternate couriers, contingency codes. They practice what to do if someone is arrested, what to say, what not to say, how to protect others while protecting themselves. These preparations are not dramatic, but they reflect an emerging understanding. Survival requires not just courage but discipline. At the same time, the group notices an unsettling development, a rise in anonymous denunciations across Berlin. Ordinary citizens, pressured or eager to demonstrate loyalty, begin reporting neighbors for suspicious behavior. A misplaced comment, an unusual visitor, a foreign book. Any of these could trigger an investigation. You follow Mildred as she hears of a colleague detained because someone overheard a remark interpreted as criticism of the government. The detention is brief, but the message is clear. Silence is now a survival skill for the entire population, not only for the resistance. The network also begins to confront an internal fear, the possibility of infiltration. They trust one another deeply, yet they know that the Gestapo's methods include using informants who appear sympathetic, skilled, or harmless. You observe them evaluating each new contact more rigorously, studying mannerisms, verifying backgrounds, seeking inconsistencies in stories. They understand that a single infiltrator could dismantle everything they have built. Trust becomes not merely a moral quality, but an operational necessity. By the end of Part A, the tightening of the net is undeniable. The group has grown more capable and more united, but the state has grown more vigilant and more methodical. Every risk is amplified. Every mistake matters. You step back and see the precarious balance, a clandestine network trying to expand just as the regime begins to sense the possibility of hidden enemies. The coming chapters will show what happens when those two trajectories collide. Pressure without sound. As 1941 unfolds, the quiet pressure surrounding the network turns into something more defined, still subtle, still largely invisible, but unmistakably directional. The Gestapo has not yet identified the Rote Kapelle, nor does it know the scale of the underground work happening beneath the surface of Berlin. But it senses movement. Somewhere in the city, someone is acting against the regime. And in a state that depends on unanimity, even a faint disturbance draws attention. You walk through a government corridor where a newly formed counterintelligence subsection prepares its daily briefings. Maps of Berlin hang on the wall with pins marking unusual incidents, intercepted letters containing odd phrasing, anonymous leaflets appearing overnight, fragments of foreign news summarized in ways inconsistent with official broadcasts. None of these incidents are clearly connected, but the pattern troubles the officers. Their reports recommend additional vigilance, deeper background checks, and expanded listening posts. These measures are not aimed at the Rote Kapelle specifically. They are aimed at the possibility of dissent. But the effect is the same. The room in which the network can maneuver becomes smaller. One of the earliest signs of this tightening comes in the form of a mild administrative anomaly. A clerk in Harro's building mentions hearing from internal security that certain departments are undergoing audits focused on information discipline. The clerk does not seem worried. He assumes it is routine. But Harro understands the implications immediately. You observe his calm reaction. He asks a few measured questions, then quietly adjusts his own habits. He avoids taking notes at work unless absolutely necessary. He reduces the amount of material he memorizes in a single day, not because he fears immediate detection, but because he recognizes that the environment has shifted from neutral to observant. A similar shift reaches the Ministry of Economics. Arvid notices new restrictions on document circulation, accompanied by quiet requests for employees to disclose any foreign contacts. The requests are framed as standard wartime precaution, but their intent is unmistakable. Arvid complies with careful neutrality, naming only those contacts that align with his official duties. You watch him preparing his statement, choosing each word with deliberate moderation, neither too detailed nor suspiciously vague. He knows that even the appearance of hesitation can invite scrutiny. Within the network itself, these subtle external changes provoke serious reflection. Mildred raises concerns about information flow during a small meeting in her apartment. She notes that delays in postal routes have become more frequent, and she questions whether the group relies too heavily on written communication. Libertas adds that she has noticed increased attention in her workplace to ideological consistency in cultural materials. These observations lead the group to consolidate their methods. Fewer written messages, more face-to-face exchanges, greater reliance on couriers who can adapt quickly to changes on the ground. The psychological toll of this new environment becomes visible in small ways. People speak more quietly. They check windows before beginning a discussion. They pause before opening a door, listening for sounds in the stairwell. You watch Arvid and Mildred share a silent glance before a meeting, an unspoken acknowledgement of the risk that now threads through their daily routines. The group is not fearful, but they are newly aware. Awareness sharpens perception, and perception becomes a survival tool. Despite the increased scrutiny, the group continues its operations. Harro passes along insights from military files, carefully filtered to avoid compromising sources inside the armed forces. Arvid contributes economic intelligence that reveals Germany's growing strain under the demands of the war. Mildred translates foreign reports that challenge the regime's propaganda. Libertas works on leaflets that counter official narratives. Each piece of work requires heightened caution. Each step forward carries another layer of risk. An incident during this period underscores the fragile balance they must maintain. A courier, trusted, experienced, reliable, returns from a delivery in an unusually shaken state. He explains that he noticed a man following him for several blocks. The follower did not approach or speak. He simply appeared behind him at several turning points. The courier altered his route, entered a crowded market, then exited through a rear entrance. The follower did not reappear. You observe the group's response to this report. They do not panic, but they consider every possibility. Was it coincidence? Was it surveillance? Was it a test? They adjust protocols accordingly, instructing couriers to vary their behaviors more frequently and to report even minor irregularities. Another incident involves a leaflet found by someone who later made an anonymous report to the authorities. The leaflet itself contains nothing traceable, but the report prompts a minor investigation in the area where it was discovered. You watch a pair of policemen canvassing the neighborhood, asking casual questions, noting who appears nervous or uncooperative. None of this leads to anything, but the investigation lasts longer than similar ones in previous months. The group takes note. They reduce leaflet distribution temporarily, focusing instead on analysis, planning, and preparation. The network's emerging contact with Soviet intelligence also deepens the sense of risk. Although their relationship with the Soviets is not one of ideological alignment, it does provide a channel for transmitting critical military and economic information. But the Soviet operatives working in Germany face their own challenges, including internal mistrust, limited resources, and constant fear of detection. You observe one of these operatives meeting with a member of the group in a secluded park. Their conversation is brief, conducted while both pretend to admire a lake. They discuss only logistics, yet both understand that the consequences of discovery would be severe. Within the group, debates continue about the extent to which they should rely on foreign intelligence agencies. Some members worry that such contact will transform them from independent resistors into instruments of external powers. Others argue that the scale of the war requires cooperation beyond Germany's borders. These discussions occur quietly, respectfully. You watch the tension between moral independence and strategic necessity play out in thoughtful exchanges, never loud, never confrontational. They understand that each viewpoint comes from a desire to act responsibly under impossible circumstances. The Gestapo's efforts to detect clandestine radio activity intensified during this period, driven by fears of espionage not only within Germany but across occupied Europe. Detection vans continue to patrol the city, and new monitoring posts appear on rooftops. Even though the group has suspended most of its transmissions, the threat remains palpable. You observe a detection van stopping briefly outside a residential building one evening, its antennae swiveling slowly. The van moves on, but its presence lingers like a shadow in the minds of those who witness it. Inside the network, these external pressures induce a new level of introspection. Members begin to ask themselves who among them is most vulnerable, who would withstand questioning, who might inadvertently reveal information under duress. These are not accusations. They are practical assessments, conducted with compassion but with clear-eyed realism. They discuss contingency plans, what to do if someone disappears, how to interpret certain signs, how to respond if one part of the network becomes compromised. You observe these discussions with quiet gravity. They reflect both the strength of their unity and the inevitability of the dangers ahead. By the end of Chapter 4, the sense of tightening is unmistakable. The network remains functional, committed, and adaptive, but the world around them grows more restrictive. The Gestapo has not yet found them, but it is searching. It does not know their names or their faces, but it senses their work. Pressure gathers like storm air, silent, directional, and dense. You step back and see the shape of what is coming. The network is strong, but the regime is methodical. Their conflict has not yet collided directly, but the distance between them is closing. Across borders, threads begin to intertwine. While Berlin remains the intellectual and emotional center of the Schulze-Boysen and Harnack circles, the network that history will label the Rote Kapelle is not confined to one city. It is not even confined to one country. By 1940–41, across Western Europe, separate groups, unaware of each other, shaped by different contexts, driven by different motivations, begin to move in similar directions. You shift your perspective now, traveling across borders quietly, observing how parallel lines of resistance emerge long before they know they will one day be connected by the same fate. Your first stop is Brussels, a city caught under the weight of occupation yet humming with hidden activity. Here operates a group led by men like Leopold Trepper, a man whose strategic mind and instinct for survival make him unlike anyone in the Berlin circle. Trepper has experience in underground work long before the German invasion. He understands tradecraft with a fluency few in Germany possess. You observe him moving through a crowded Brussels market, glancing at reflections in shop windows, noting who appears too still, too observant. He does not conceal his caution. It is part of who he is. In Trepper's circles, espionage is not an improvisation. It is a profession. The Brussels Group builds networks under the guise of import-export businesses. Offices filled with ledgers and invoices mask coded reports and courier routes. Their radio operators work with discipline born from training, transmitting only at predetermined times and frequencies. You watch one operator adjust his dials carefully, sending a burst of encoded data to a Soviet receiver far beyond German reach. His movements are precise, economical. He understands that every second the transmitter is active increases the risk of detection. And yet, for now, he succeeds. This Belgian network has almost nothing in common with the Berlin groups. Different languages, different structures, different politics. But they share a guiding belief. Truth must move across borders, and silence is complicity. They do not know that, in the Gestapo's imagination, they will eventually be portrayed as a single coordinated machine. From Brussels you move to Paris, where a loose collection of journalists, radio technicians, and former political activists gathers information behind the facade of normal professionalism. Paris under German occupation is constrained but not fully crushed, and pockets of intellectual life still flicker in private rooms. You observe a writer passing a small envelope to a contact near the River Seine. Inside the envelope is not a literary manuscript, but a report on troop movements observed along key transit corridors. These individuals do not think of themselves as part of a European resistance. They simply use the skills they already possess, observation, writing, communication, to push back against domination. Their methods differ from those in Brussels. Rather than sophisticated radio networks, the Paris cluster relies more heavily on couriers and coded written messages. They move information through social channels rather than technical ones. Their strengths lie in their ability to blend into cultural life, to use conversation and connection as tools for gathering intelligence. From Paris you travel further south, tracing threads toward Switzerland, a country officially neutral but alive with clandestine traffic. Diplomats, journalists, businessmen, and refugees move through Swiss cities carrying fragments of intelligence. You enter a cafe near a railway station where a man quietly takes notes while pretending to read a newspaper. This individual is not part of either the Berlin or Brussels groups. He is not formally aligned with Soviet intelligence, but he gathers information nonetheless: military gossip overheard in transit, subtle changes in troop transport schedules, whispered accounts from refugees fleeing occupied territories. He passes these fragments to intermediaries who send them to different destinations, sometimes to British intelligence, sometimes to contacts in the Soviet network, sometimes to independent resistance groups. Across Europe, these clusters operate without a shared agenda. Each sees a piece of the wider picture. None sees the full panorama. They do not coordinate operations, share leadership, or even know the others exist. Yet their work collectively undermines the regime's ability to control information. They become, unknowingly, the instruments in the metaphor the Gestapo will one day impose upon them. The Soviet intelligence apparatus, though strained and not always efficient, begins attempting to link these independent groups together. Its operatives see Europe not as isolated pockets of resistance, but as a mosaic of potential allies. Messages sent from Moscow urge contacts to find like-minded individuals in occupied regions. Some succeed, many do not. You watch as a Soviet handler in Brussels attempts to make contact with individuals in Paris, only to find communication sporadic and dangerous. Not because the groups distrust one another, but because each circle operates within its own constraints, shaped by local realities. In Berlin, the Harnacks and Schulze-Boysens remain unaware of the full European scope. They suspect the existence of resistance beyond Germany's borders. Ideas travel, stories circulate, but they do not know names, faces, or structures. Their world remains focused on German society, German policy, German responsibility. Yet subtle hints of broader activity begin to reach them. A courier mentions hearing rumors of similar dissent in Belgium. A foreign student tells Mildred about underground publications in France. Harro reads a report noting increased vigilance regarding radio transmissions coming from Western Europe. These signals drift into their awareness like shadows flickering at the edge of vision. Meanwhile, the Gestapo and the Abwehr begin building the narrative that will later define the network in the eyes of the state. They notice a pattern in intercepted messages across Western Europe, similar encryption styles, parallel content themes, repeated references to German military activity. They assume coordination. They assume hierarchy. They imagine a single conductor orchestrating a network of spies across the continent. You observe an officer in a Berlin intelligence office drawing lines on a map that connect Brussels to Paris to Berlin. The lines are speculative, but they satisfy an internal logic the regime prefers. Enemies must be organized, for if they are organized, they can be defeated through structure. In reality, the connections are far looser. The Berlin group shares information with Soviet contacts who also receive reports from Brussels. The Paris group occasionally transmits intelligence through a channel that sometimes overlaps with Brussels. These intersections create the illusion of unity, but the groups remain distinct, separate hearts beating in separate cities, sometimes aware of one another, often not. For the Berlin network, this period marks the beginning of a subtle transition. They begin to understand that their work may be part of a larger struggle. Not because they seek international coordination, but because they recognize that tyranny in one country spreads its consequences across continents. You watch Harro seated in his apartment, considering the possibility that others are fighting similar battles elsewhere in Europe. His expression is not one of pride, but of somber clarity. If resistance exists in multiple places, then failure in one place might endanger others, just as success might strengthen them. As Part A closes, you step back and see Europe as a patchwork of flickering, fragile lights. None of the groups are strong alone. None have the resources or numbers to confront the regime directly. But together, though they do not yet realize it, they form a constellation of opposition that challenges the narrative of total control. The Gestapo will call them an orchestra. The truth is simpler and more human. They are voices refusing silence, scattered across a continent that desperately needs them. A continent of echoes. As 1941 deepens into 1942, the scattered European groups continue their work under vastly different conditions. Some operate in territories under tight German control. Others move through regions where occupation feels uneven, where pockets of autonomy remain. Still others work from neutral zones where the war's frontiers are less visible but no less influential. You shift quietly through these environments, observing how people with no knowledge of one another nonetheless walk parallel paths. The Soviet intelligence service, already stretched thin, often improvising its own survival, attempts to impose coherence on these disparate efforts. Its operatives send coded instructions encouraging networks to coordinate, share resources, and combine intelligence streams. Yet the messages often travel slowly, sometimes arriving late, occasionally misunderstood or incomplete. You watch a Soviet courier in Brussels deciphering a message that instructs his network to make contact with sympathetic groups in France. He sees the logic. Coordination could strengthen their work. But he also knows the limitations. The Paris clusters operate differently, with different tradecraft, different vulnerabilities, and different levels of caution. He wonders whether reaching out will strengthen both groups, or endanger them. While Brussels struggles with the logistics of communication, the Paris circles navigate their own complexities. They operate under occupation, but within a city that retains a measure of civil life. Their resistance takes the form of observation, writing, and discreet exchanges in cafés and bookstores. They receive fragments of Soviet communication through intermediaries, but their responses are often hesitant. You observe a meeting in a cramped Paris apartment where a journalist and a technician debate whether closer cooperation with Soviet-linked groups might bring unwanted attention from German counterintelligence. Their concern is not ideological but practical. Too much structure can create patterns, and patterns can be traced. These scattered hesitations create gaps in the emerging network, gaps Soviet handlers struggle to understand. In Moscow's perspective, the European resistance appears fragmented, reluctant, and frustratingly inconsistent. In reality, each group is calculating its survival, balancing the desire to act with the need to protect its members. You observe these calculations. A Belgian operative weighing whether to send a courier across a heavily monitored border, a French writer deciding whether the message she decoded is too risky to pass along, a Swiss intermediary choosing which information is valuable enough to justify immediate transmission. Back in Berlin, the Harnack and Schulze-Boysen circles begin to glimpse hints of this wider network. They receive coded messages that reference intelligence gathered in Belgium and France. They learn, indirectly, that other groups are transmitting economic and military data similar to their own. These realizations do not create excitement but sobering clarity. If others are acting across Europe, the danger is not limited to their city. And if the Soviets view the continent as a single theater of intelligence, then the risks of cross-border entanglement grow exponentially. Harro, in particular, senses the strategic tension. He is not a professional intelligence officer. His resistance is rooted in moral conviction rather than clandestine training. You observe him in his apartment discussing a recent Soviet message with Libertas. The message encourages improved coordination, more frequent communication, and the sharing of specific military documents. Harro frowns, not out of fear but out of caution. He understands what the Soviet handlers do not. Germany's internal counterintelligence has become far more sophisticated than outsiders realize. Too much activity, too much structure, too many overlapping contacts. These things create exposure. Harro worries that the Soviets are asking for a level of coordination that Berlin cannot safely maintain. Arvid shares this concern. His background in economics and political theory gives him a long view of systems, how they grow, where they fail, why complexity increases vulnerability. You watch him explain to Mildred that connecting too many independent nodes can create a chain reaction of risk. If one link breaks, many others follow. The Soviet perspective favors centralization. Arvid's instincts lean toward decentralization, a network of small, semi-independent cells, sharing filtered intelligence but maintaining operational separation. He does not reject cooperation. He rejects the idea that unity requires exposure. Yet communication with the Soviets continues, not because the Berlin Group feels compelled, but because they believe that transmitting accurate intelligence about German military and economic plans may save lives. They focus their transmissions on information that reveals strategic intentions, troop movements, fuel allocations, production estimates. You observe Harro reviewing an Air Force document that outlines planned operations in Eastern Europe. The information is precise and potentially decisive. He debates whether sending it might alter the course of events. In the end, the group decides to transmit, convinced that the stakes justify the risk. As the Berlin Group participates in this fragile continental exchange, the Gestapo begins to detect faint signals, echoes of activity scattered across multiple regions. None of these echoes point directly to Berlin. None reveal operational structures. But the patterns provoke curiosity. You enter the office of a German counterintelligence officer as he examines a set of intercepted messages, encrypted, but with stylistic similarities. He notes that several foreign broadcasts reference internal German information too detailed to have leaked accidentally. He does not yet see the Berlin Group, but he sees the shape of a possibility: coordinated espionage. The officer reports his findings to his superiors, who begin constructing an analytical model. Their assumptions reflect a mix of logic and ideological bias. If resistance exists across Europe, it must be connected. If spies in Belgium transmit Soviet-coded messages, their counterparts in Germany must share their ideology. If multiple groups act in parallel, they must be following a conductor. Thus emerges the Gestapo's earliest conception of the Rote Kapelle, not as scattered clusters of human beings defending dignity, but as a single, centrally directed espionage orchestra. This misinterpretation is not harmless. It becomes the framework within which future investigations operate. Once the Gestapo imagines unity, it searches for links. Once it assumes coordination, it seeks proof of hierarchy. Every intercepted message, every anonymous report, every suspicious encounter becomes evidence of a larger conspiracy. You watch an officer draw yet another line on a map, connecting Berlin, Brussels, and Paris, based not on fact but on internal logic. These lines will become chains. Meanwhile, the Berlin network's activities intensify. Harro passes along intelligence about German air strategy. Arvid provides economic data that reveals stress points in the war machine. Mildred and Libertas continue to translate, analyze, and document. Couriers operate with practiced ease. Yet the psychological undertone shifts subtly. You observe the tension in their movements, the way they double-check meeting points, the way they pause before knocking on a door. They feel the atmosphere changing. It is not fear, it is recognition. This recognition crystallizes during a quiet conversation between Harro and a trusted colleague. The colleague mentions hearing rumors that the Gestapo has begun investigating unusual patterns in foreign radio traffic. He does not know specifics. He does not know who is suspected, but his tone conveys the essential truth: someone is being hunted. Harro listens without revealing emotion. When he returns home, he shares the information with Libertas. They say little, but their silence speaks clearly. The network must tighten further. Even as danger grows, a deeper sense of purpose takes hold within the group. They understand that their work now intersects with something larger than themselves, larger than Berlin, larger than Germany. Across Europe, others act in parallel, unknowingly connected by danger, necessity, and the faint lines traced by Soviet intelligence. They are not united by structure, but by conscience. By the end of Chapter 5, these separate clusters have not yet collided, but they are now linked, through messages, rumors, misinterpretations, and shared enemies. The continent is filled with echoes, some clear, some faint, all dangerous. And the Gestapo has begun listening more closely. Tracing unseen signals. By early 1942, German counterintelligence begins to shift from broad vigilance to targeted suspicion, not because they know the Berlin Group exists, but because fragments of activity across Europe refuse to align with a narrative of perfect internal control. You move now into the rooms where this shift takes shape, not the shadowed apartments of resistance members, but the bright offices where officers attempt to chart patterns in the dark. Inside an aware building, a team of cryptanalysts examines a series of intercepted messages originating from Belgium and France. The messages differ in content and tone, but share structural similarities that trouble them. Their encryption method, though not unique, is consistent enough to suggest coordination. One officer circles repeated sequences on a sheet of paper. "This," he says to a colleague, "is not amateur work." He assumes the existence of a unified network because the idea fits the regime's worldview. Enemies must be part of a grand plan. They cannot imagine that courage appears spontaneously. This assumption becomes the first thread in the net that will slowly tighten around the Rote Kapelle. Meanwhile, detection vans continue patrolling Berlin at irregular intervals. Their teams operate not on precise intelligence, but on the belief that clandestine radios must exist somewhere in the capital. They drive through neighborhoods with windows darkened by blackout curtains, stopping occasionally to scan frequencies. You watch a van pause near a row of apartment blocks, the crew adjusting their equipment with quiet focus. They detect nothing concrete, only faint static, atmospheric noise, the hum of the city. But they log the area anyway. Over time, these logs accumulate into patterns. Some patterns reflect reality, others reflect coincidence. But the officers treat them all as leads. Inside Berlin's ministries, new audit protocols further narrow the space in which resistance can operate. Harro Schulze-Boysen notices that certain files now require 2 signatures rather than 1. Meetings include silent observers who take notes without participating. Harro recognizes them for what they are: internal monitors. You see him carry out his duties with calm precision, speaking in the measured tone expected of a loyal officer. Yet beneath this surface, he adjusts his methods once more, memorizing only what is essential, dividing sensitive information across multiple meetings, limiting the frequency of his own requests for documents. Arvid Harnack confronts a different but equally challenging shift. The Ministry of Economics introduces new requirements for foreign correspondence, with every letter to or from another country subject to additional scrutiny. While Arvid rarely communicates directly with foreign contacts, the new rule signals increased attention to international links. You observe him reading the directive carefully before folding it into his desk drawer. He knows that any contact perceived as unusual, no matter how innocent, may invite questions. He tightens his routines accordingly, reducing conversations, avoiding unnecessary interactions, conducting more analysis in his own mind rather than on paper. The Gestapo's growing interest in Belgian and French transmissions does not yet extend explicitly to Berlin's internal dissent. Yet the clues they gather begin to ripple outward, shaping suspicions that will eventually touch the capital. Reports mention that certain intercepted messages contain references to German economic figures and military movements. This information, though partial and ambiguous, suggests that someone within Germany is providing it. You watch a counterintelligence officer draw a circle around Berlin on a map, not because he has proof, but because it is the logical place to begin looking. At the same time, small incidents inside Berlin feed the tightening climate. A worker at a printing office overhears a conversation about leaflets and reports it to the police. The report leads nowhere. The individuals involved are discussing legal publications, but the investigation lasts long enough to unsettle the surrounding community. Mildred hears about this incident and brings it to the group's attention. It reinforces what they already understand. Fear is now widespread, and fear can generate dangerous misunderstandings. Another incident involves a postal clerk who notices unusual routing patterns in a series of letters passing through his station. He does not understand the codes within the letters, but he finds the phrasing odd and reports it to superiors. The letters are innocuous, written by people with no relation to the network, but the report triggers a brief review of postal irregularities. This review leads to new monitoring procedures. Unrelated citizens become suspect for reasons they do not fully understand. Yet the environment these reactions create makes clandestine communication even more precarious. Within the network, signs of the tightening net become visible as tension in small, quiet moments. Couriers linger slightly longer before stepping into the street. Members check their surroundings with increased care. Conversations pause when unexpected footsteps echo in hallways. You watch Harro pausing by his apartment window one evening, scanning the courtyard below before sitting at his desk. He has no reason to believe he is watched, yet he feels the atmosphere shifting. Mildred and Libertas, too, sense the change. Mildred notices that a colleague seems unusually curious about her research interests. Libertas observes more uniformed presence near cultural institutions, along with subtle new restrictions on reviewing photographic material. These observations, while not alarming individually, form a pattern the group cannot ignore. Despite the risk, their work continues. Harro identifies key intelligence regarding German strategic preparations in the East. Arvid analyzes new economic directives that reveal strain on the war machine. Mildred compiles foreign summaries that offer clarity unavailable in German publications. Libertas refines visual materials for future leaflets. Each step of these efforts requires new layers of caution. They subdivide tasks more carefully, compartmentalize knowledge more fully, and schedule meetings with greater precision. Yet risk does not arise only from state surveillance. Human error, small, unintentional, often invisible, becomes a growing concern. A courier misses a step in his planned route and must double back, creating a pattern that could be noticed. A verbal message is delivered using a phrase too similar to one used previously, raising the risk of association. A leaflet appears in a district earlier than planned, spreading faster than the group intended. You witness these errors with perspective. None are fatal, but each is a reminder of how narrow the margin has become. The Soviets, meanwhile, increase their requests for intelligence. Their war with Germany has escalated violently, and they view the Berlin Group as a vital source of insight into German intentions. You observe Harro reading a message that asks for more frequent updates and more detailed military data. He understands why the Soviets ask, but he also understands the cost. More data means more risk. More transmissions mean more chances of detection. He brings the message to Arvid, and they discuss it quietly at a small table in a back room. They decide to maintain their pace, not accelerate it. Their caution is not disloyal. It is essential to survival. Yet even this careful pace cannot prevent the gradual convergence of external attention. The Gestapo knows someone in Germany is providing intelligence to the Soviets. The Abwehr suspects that the information originates in Berlin. Radio detection units expand their patrols. Administrative audits tighten. Anonymous reports multiply. These forces move along parallel tracks, unaware of one another, yet heading toward the same destination. By the end of Part A, the confrontation between the Rote Kapelle and the German state has not yet erupted. The group remains hidden, functioning, and disciplined. But the air has changed. Tension settles over their work like a film. Each action feels heavier. Each choice carries more weight. You step back and see the path forming beneath their feet, narrow, dangerous, and irreversible. The net has not closed, but it has begun to take shape. When patterns become targets. By mid-1942, the German intelligence services no longer speak in possibilities. Their internal language shifts from irregularities to sources, from coincidences to structures. The distinction matters. Once a state decides that an enemy exists, it no longer asks whether resistance is happening. It asks where. You move now through the offices where this decision quietly takes hold, watching how suspicion matures into method. Inside an Abwehr analysis room, intercepted radio traffic from Western Europe is laid out chronologically. Officers compare signal lengths, transmission intervals, and stylistic markers. None of this produces immediate certainty. But certainty is not required. Pattern is enough. One officer notes that several transmissions referencing German economic data align closely with reports from the Ministry of Economics. Another observes that military terminology in some messages reflects insider familiarity rather than second-hand knowledge. These observations do not point to a name. They point to a place. Berlin begins to dominate the map. At the same time, Gestapo units intensify background investigations within ministries connected to strategic planning. These are not overt interrogations. They are quiet reviews, career histories examined for ideological deviation, social circles mapped for overlap, routines observed for irregularity. You watch a file being opened, then another, then another. Each file contains nothing remarkable on its own. But intelligence work is cumulative. It builds meaning from accumulation. Harro Schulze-Boysen feels this shift before he understands it. The environment around him grows subtly sharper. Conversations are shorter. Questions are more precise. A colleague mentions, almost casually, that internal security has requested lists of staff who travel frequently between departments. The comment is not aimed at Harro, but it lingers. You observe him adjusting his schedule, reducing movement between offices, blending more deeply into expected routines. He does not panic. He adapts. But adaptation now feels like compression, less room to move. Arvid Harnack encounters similar friction. A routine data request is delayed, returned with a note asking for clarification. The wording is polite, bureaucratic, neutral. Yet Arvid recognizes the significance immediately. Questions, once rare, are becoming systematic. You watch him revise his request, simplifying it, removing any detail that could invite follow-up. He understands that the safest intelligence is often the least ambitious. Within the network, these external signals trigger a careful recalibration. Meetings are reduced further. Some communication channels are suspended entirely. The group begins rotating meeting locations more aggressively, even at the cost of efficiency. You observe a discussion between Harro and Libertas, where they consider halting leaflet distribution temporarily. The decision is difficult. Leaflets are visible proof of resistance. But visibility is no longer an asset. It is a liability. One of the most dangerous developments comes from beyond Berlin. In Belgium, radio operators connected, loosely and indirectly, to the same Soviet intelligence stream make a fatal misjudgment. Pressured by demands for information, they transmit more frequently than advised. You follow the consequences as German radio detection units triangulate the source over several nights. The operators do not know they are being tracked. The net closes quietly. When arrests occur, they are swift and devastating. These arrests ripple outward. Documents are seized. Codes are recovered. Interrogations begin, not immediately violent, but methodical. The German services are patient. They understand that pressure works better when applied slowly. You observe an interrogator allowing silence to stretch, letting the weight of uncertainty do its work. Information emerges, not full confessions, not names, but fragments. Place names, communication styles, mentions of contacts further east. Berlin appears again. This does not yet translate into direct action against the Berlin Group, but it changes the tone of internal briefings. Officers no longer speak hypothetically about a Soviet-linked espionage effort. They refer to it as active, coordinated, ongoing. The metaphor of an orchestra begins to surface, not as a poetic label, but as a conceptual framework. Different instruments, different locations, one guiding rhythm. It is wrong, but it is compelling. You watch as this framework shapes investigative behavior. Officers begin seeking conductors rather than individuals. They look for hubs rather than isolated actors. They assume that people who know one another must operate together. Coincidences become connections. Overlaps become proof. Inside Berlin, the atmosphere tightens further. A neighbor mentions that police asked casual questions about residents in the building. The questions are not accusatory. They are observational. Who comes and goes? Who receives visitors? Who works unusual hours? You observe Mildred absorbing this information quietly. She does not react outwardly. But later, she alters her routines, reducing social interaction even with trusted contacts. The network now lives inside a paradox. To survive, it must reduce activity. But reducing activity risks losing relevance to foreign intelligence partners, to the flow of truth they believe matters. Each decision feels like a compromise between danger and purpose. You watch Harro weighing these options late at night, seated at his desk, the room lit softly to avoid drawing attention. His expression reflects neither fear nor confidence, but clarity. He understands that they have crossed into a phase where control is limited. Events beyond their reach are shaping their fate. The Soviets continue requesting intelligence, unaware or unwilling to fully acknowledge that their broader network is fracturing. Messages urge urgency, speed, quantity. The Berlin Group responds selectively, choosing accuracy over volume. Yet even this restraint cannot erase the trail already forming. Intelligence does not vanish when it stops flowing. It leaves residue, in records, in patterns, in assumptions already embedded in enemy analysis. The most unsettling realization arrives gradually. The group has not been discovered because of betrayal within Berlin. It has been discovered because the world around it has grown smaller. Surveillance has expanded. Technology has improved. Borders have hardened. What once slipped through cracks now collides with walls. You observe the members of the network adjusting not only their methods but their expectations. Conversations turn to contingency more frequently. What if someone disappears? What if contact suddenly ceases? What if one channel collapses entirely? These discussions are quiet, disciplined, and resolute. There is no talk of escape, no talk of abandonment, only preparation. By the end of Chapter 6, the shape of what is coming becomes unmistakable. The German intelligence services are no longer searching blindly. They are narrowing focus. The Berlin group remains unidentified, but it is no longer invisible. The shadow moving toward them has mass and direction. You step back and see the final truth of this phase. The Rotkapelle is not being hunted because it failed. It is being hunted because it worked. The first doors close. The collapse of a clandestine network rarely announces itself. It does not begin with sirens or mass arrests, but with absences, conversations that stop, messages that do not arrive, doors that remain unopened. By late 1942, these absences begin to accumulate across Europe, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. You move through this narrowing landscape, watching how a system built on connection starts to lose its connective tissue. In Belgium, the arrests triggered by radio interception expand quietly. The initial detainees are questioned separately, moved between locations, and confronted not with accusations but with fragments of information already known. The interrogators do not rush. They understand that people speak more freely when they believe they are not yet fully exposed. You observe the careful rhythm of these interrogations, questions asked casually, pauses allowed to stretch, documents placed on a table without explanation. Each gesture is designed to create uncertainty rather than fear. From these sessions emerge names, some real, some misunderstood, some incomplete. Addresses are mentioned vaguely. Cities are referenced indirectly. Berlin appears again, not as a confirmed location, but as a gravitational center toward which several threads seem to point. The German services take note. They begin cross-referencing intercepted material with personnel lists in strategic ministries. The process is slow, deliberate, and relentless. In Paris, similar pressures emerge. A courier fails to arrive at a scheduled rendezvous. Another is detained briefly and released, but his behavior afterward suggests he has been shaken. Meetings are postponed. Contacts hesitate. You observe a Parisian writer tearing up a notebook she had kept for years, the act deliberate and irreversible. She understands what the silence means. Someone, somewhere, has been caught. These developments do not reach Berlin as official reports. They arrive as intuition. A Soviet contact misses a scheduled exchange. A coded message contains unusual phrasing, as though written under constraint. The absence of expected detail becomes its own form of communication. You watch Harro reading such a message, noting what is missing rather than what is present. He does not say it aloud, but he understands. Something has gone wrong. Inside Berlin, the group responds with discipline rather than panic. Meetings are suspended entirely for several weeks. Communication is reduced to essential signals only. Couriers are instructed to halt operations unless explicitly summoned. You observe this retreat not as surrender, but as preservation, a final attempt to keep what remains intact. The network becomes almost still, like an animal freezing in the presence of danger. Meanwhile, German counterintelligence shifts into confirmation mode. Investigators who once speculated now verify. They compare statements from Belgian detainees with internal surveillance reports. They notice overlaps in social circles. They identify individuals whose names appear repeatedly, not as suspects, but as nodes. You enter an office where an analyst pins a photograph to a board, then another, then another. The board does not yet show a full picture, but it begins to resemble one. Harro's name does not appear immediately. Neither does Arvid's. But their environments come under closer observation. Phones are monitored. Mail is screened more thoroughly. Buildings are watched at irregular intervals. You observe this escalation from a distance. An unmarked car parked across the street for too long, a man lingering near an entrance without apparent purpose. None of this is overt, but it is deliberate. Within the network, trust remains intact, but fear becomes a shared undercurrent. Libertas notices unfamiliar faces near cultural institutions she frequents. Mildred hears that a colleague has been questioned about foreign contacts. Arvid learns that background checks are being quietly updated. These developments are not accusations, but they feel like the tightening of a collar. You watch them share this information in hushed, precise exchanges, each person contributing a piece of the larger picture. One of the most telling moments comes when a courier fails to appear entirely. Days pass with no word. The absence is absolute. You observe Harro and Arvid discussing the implications. They do not speculate wildly. They consider only what must be done next. Certain documents are destroyed. Certain contact lists are reduced to memory alone. Certain names are no longer spoken. These actions are not desperate. They are procedural. The group has long prepared for this possibility. Beyond Berlin, the collapse accelerates. In Belgium, arrests expand outward from radio operators to logistics handlers and financial intermediaries. In Paris, several individuals disappear quietly, their absence explained publicly as routine detentions. In Switzerland, intermediaries sever contact entirely, understanding that neutrality offers no protection against suspicion. You observe how the European constellation that once flickered with cautious coordination begins to dim. The Gestapo's confidence grows accordingly. Internal reports now refer explicitly to a Soviet-directed espionage network operating across Western Europe and Germany. The metaphor of the Red Orchestra solidifies, not as an insult, but as an analytical construct. Different cities are described as sections. Radio operators are labeled instrumentalists. Berlin is identified as a probable command center. The framework is flawed, but it is sufficient to justify action. Back in Berlin, the group feels the weight of this shift without seeing its full shape. Harro becomes more withdrawn, limiting even informal contact. You observe him walking through the city with heightened awareness, choosing routes carefully, avoiding patterns. Yet his demeanor remains composed. He understands that panic would only hasten discovery. Arvid, too, adjusts his behavior. He avoids prolonged conversations. He reduces his presence in shared spaces. He begins preparing mentally for outcomes he has long known were possible. You watch him sorting personal papers at home, separating what can remain from what must be destroyed. The act is methodical, almost ritualistic. Mildred and Libertas feel the shift in different ways. Mildred senses the narrowing of academic freedom, the sudden caution in colleagues' speech. Libertas notices increased scrutiny in cultural circles, where creativity is now measured against loyalty. Both understand that the social spaces they once used as cover are closing. By the end of Part A, the collapse is no longer hypothetical. It has begun, unevenly, asymmetrically, and mostly out of sight. The network still exists, but its margins are fraying. Its ability to move is shrinking. Its enemies are no longer guessing. You step back and see the quiet truth of this moment. The Rote Kapelle is not yet broken, but the doors around it are beginning to close. The first arrests in Berlin do not come as a single coordinated strike. They arrive unevenly, shaped by opportunity rather than precision. A knock at a door just before dawn. A routine summons that does not end in release. A colleague who leaves work one afternoon and does not return. You move through the city as these moments accumulate, watching how a network built on quiet movement begins to fracture under the pressure of sudden stillness. German counterintelligence has reached the point where suspicion no longer needs confirmation to justify action. Files assembled from disparate sources, radio intercepts, interrogations abroad, internal surveillance, now point toward individuals whose positions grant them access the regime cannot explain away. Berlin is no longer a theory. It is an operational target. One morning, officers arrive at the apartment of a peripheral contact, someone not central to the network, but close enough to be useful. The arrest is efficient, restrained, almost polite. There is no public scene. Neighbors notice only the sound of measured footsteps on the stairwell and the brief presence of men in plain clothes. The arrested individual is taken away without resistance. You observe this moment from a distance, understanding its significance. The net is no longer abstract. It has entered the city. Interrogation begins immediately, though not violently. The German services favor method over force. They present fragments of information already known, allowing the detainee to confirm or deny rather than invent. Silence is met with patience. Cooperation is framed as rational self-preservation. You watch how pressure is applied not through pain, but through isolation, repetition, and the steady erosion of certainty. Each answer reveals something small, a name mentioned casually, a meeting referenced vaguely, a relationship implied but not fully explained. These fragments are enough. Within days, additional arrests follow. Some are summoned to offices under routine pretenses and never return home. Others are detained at workplaces, escorted out by men who do not raise their voices. The pattern becomes visible to those still free. Absences multiply. Chairs remain empty. Conversations halt mid-thought. You observe how the city absorbs these disappearances without comment. Berlin has learned how to look away. Harro Schulze-Boysen senses the shift before his own arrest. He hears of a colleague taken in for questioning. He notices an unmarked car parked too consistently near his building. He feels the tightening of attention in his workplace, the subtle changes in how people address him. You watch him move through his final days of freedom with controlled awareness, destroying remaining notes, committing key information to memory, severing unnecessary contact. He does not attempt to flee. He understands that escape would compromise others. Staying is an act of containment. Arvid Harnack experiences a similar narrowing. He is questioned briefly about administrative matters, then released. The questioning is courteous, professional, and carefully framed. You observe him answering calmly, aware that this may not be the end. When he returns home, he and Mildred speak little. They know what is coming. Their preparations are quiet, papers sorted, certain books removed, names no longer spoken. There is no panic, only acceptance shaped by long foresight. The arrests intensify. One by one, members of the Berlin Circle are taken. Some disappear in the early morning. Others are summoned and detained. You observe the sequence not as a dramatic cascade, but as a slow extinguishing of lights across the city. Each arrest reduces the network's ability to function, but also reduces the risk to those still at large. Compartmentalization, once a safeguard, now becomes a form of mercy. When Harro is finally arrested, it is without ceremony. Officers arrive with documentation already prepared. The search of his apartment is thorough but restrained. They know what they are looking for, even if they do not yet know its full meaning. You observe Harro as he is escorted away, calm, composed, neither defiant nor broken. He understands that the role he played is finished. What remains is endurance. Arvid's arrest follows soon after. He is taken from his office under the pretense of administrative questioning. Colleagues watch in silence. Some avert their eyes. Others remain expressionless, trained by years of fear. You observe Arvid adjusting his coat before leaving, a small gesture of dignity in a moment stripped of control. He does not resist. He knows resistance here would achieve nothing. Mildred and Libertas are arrested as well. Their detentions reflect the regime's recognition that resistance is not limited to those with official power. Intellectual influence, translation, cultural work, these too are considered threats. You observe their arrests with the same quiet gravity. Each is taken separately, preventing any final exchange of words. The regime understands the power of connection and seeks to deny it. Inside detention facilities, the interrogations continue. The Gestapo and military intelligence services attempt to reconstruct the network in full. They ask about hierarchies, directives, and command structures that do not truly exist. The metaphor of the Red Orchestra shapes their questioning. They look for conductors. They look for written orders. They look for ideological unity. What they find instead are overlapping relationships, shared convictions, and independent action guided by conscience rather than instruction. This frustrates them. You observe interrogators growing increasingly certain that a larger structure must exist simply because they cannot comprehend resistance without central control. Their assumptions harden. They begin interpreting inconsistencies not as evidence of decentralization, but as signs of concealment. Each refusal to confirm their model is taken as further proof of its existence. For those detained, the pressure is immense. Isolation replaces connection. Time loses structure. Days blur. Yet within this confinement, many maintain a remarkable discipline. They speak cautiously. They confirm little. They deny nothing unnecessarily. You observe this restraint not as heroism, but as loyalty, an effort to protect others even as personal freedom disappears. Outside, the remaining fragments of the network fall silent. Couriers cease movement. Communication channels collapse. Foreign contacts receive nothing but absence. The European constellation that once flickered across borders goes dark almost entirely. You observe how quickly such systems vanish once exposed. Not with explosions, but with emptiness. The Gestapo now believes it has uncovered the heart of a vast espionage conspiracy. Reports circulate describing a Soviet-directed network embedded deep within German society. The term Rote Kapelle becomes official. Files are stamped. Charts are finalized. The narrative is set. It is inaccurate in many details, but accuracy is no longer the goal. Control is. By the end of Chapter 7, the resistance that once moved quietly through Berlin has been dismantled. Not completely understood. Not fully mapped. But effectively neutralized. The people who carried it now sit in cells, interrogation rooms, or transit facilities, separated from one another and from the world they tried to change. You step back from the city and feel the weight of the silence that follows. The music has stopped. The orchestra has been named, and the consequences are only beginning. Judged in silence. The dismantling of the Rotkapelle does not end with arrests. For the regime, arrest is only a transitional state, a way station between exposure and erasure. What follows unfolds behind closed doors, governed by procedures that resemble justice in form but not in substance. You move now into this quieter phase, where the machinery of punishment operates without spectacle and without doubt. The trials begin in secrecy. There are no public announcements, no press coverage, no opportunity for defense in any meaningful sense. The charges are prepared in advance, framed not as individual acts of dissent, but as components of a single, expansive conspiracy. Treason is the central word, repeated with ritual consistency. The regime insists that the accused are not citizens guided by conscience, but instruments of a foreign power. You observe how language is used here not to describe reality, but to replace it. Inside the courtrooms, proceedings are brief. Evidence is presented selectively, often drawn from interrogations conducted under prolonged isolation. Documents are introduced without context. Connections are asserted rather than demonstrated. You watch as judges, many already aligned with the regime, move efficiently through cases, uninterested in nuance or explanation. The outcome is never in question. The process exists not to determine guilt, but to formalize it. Harro Schulze-Boysen stands before this system with the same composure that marked his work in freedom. He listens to accusations that portray him as a central organizer of a Soviet espionage ring. The description bears little resemblance to the reality of his actions. Yet accuracy no longer matters. The court needs a conductor, and Harro fits the role they have created. You observe the disconnect between the man and the narrative imposed upon him. It is total. Arvid Harnack faces similar treatment. His academic background, his foreign connections, his access to economic data, these are reframed as evidence of ideological subversion. His analyses are presented as deliberate sabotage. His restraint is interpreted as calculation. You watch as the court strips away context, reducing a complex human life to a set of charges designed to justify a predetermined sentence. Mildred Harnack's trial reveals another layer of the regime's fear. Her foreign nationality becomes a central focus. Her teaching and translations are described as tools of infiltration. The court portrays her intellectual independence as dangerous influence. You observe how the regime responds to what it cannot control, by recasting thought itself as criminal. Libertas Schulze-Boysen is judged not only for her association with Harro, but for her cultural work. Her involvement in film, photography, and publication is reframed as propaganda activity on behalf of the enemy. Creativity, in this courtroom, is treated as a threat equal to espionage. You watch as the regime attempts to criminalize imagination, understanding instinctively that ideas are harder to contain than weapons. Across these trials, a consistent pattern emerges. The accused are denied the ability to define their own actions. Their motives are rewritten. Their relationships are distorted. The decentralized nature of their resistance is ignored entirely. The Gestapo's metaphor of the Red Orchestra becomes legal fact. Each defendant is assigned a role within this imagined structure, regardless of reality. The orchestra must have sections, and so the court invents them. The sentences are severe. Some are delivered swiftly, others after brief delays meant to give the illusion of deliberation. You observe the language used to announce them, formal, restrained, bureaucratic. There is no expression of doubt. The regime presents punishment as necessity, not cruelty. In doing so, It seeks to normalize repression, to make it appear inevitable rather than chosen. For those sentenced, the experience is one of profound isolation. They are separated from one another, denied the comfort of shared understanding. Letters are restricted or censored. Visits are rare. Time loses its familiar structure. You observe how individuals adapt to this confinement differently. Some retreat inward, preserving their sense of self through memory and thought. Others focus on small routines, anchoring themselves in repetition. None know the full scope of what is happening to the others. This separation is deliberate. The regime understands that solidarity is dangerous. Outside the prison walls, the official narrative takes shape. Internal reports circulate describing the successful destruction of a major espionage network. The term rote Kapelle appears with increasing frequency, now stripped of its earlier uncertainty. It becomes a symbol of vigilance and victory. The regime does not publicize details, but it ensures that the message reaches the right audiences. Resistance has been identified, exposed, and eliminated. Yet even as the regime attempts to assert control over the story, cracks appear. Some interrogators privately acknowledge inconsistencies in the case. Some officials note the absence of clear hierarchy. Others quietly question the scale of the alleged conspiracy. These doubts never surface publicly. They remain buried in marginal notes, unspoken reservations, and private conversations. The system does not reward hesitation. For the families of the accused, the ordeal unfolds in fragments. Notices arrive without explanation. Requests for information are denied or delayed. You observe a family member reading a formal letter that provides no comfort, only procedure. They are left to assemble meaning from absence, to guess at outcomes without confirmation. The regime understands that uncertainty is itself a form of punishment. As Part A draws to a close, the trials have accomplished their intended purpose. The individuals who formed the core of the Rote Kapelle have been formally erased from public life. Their actions have been redefined. Their voices have been silenced. The regime believes it has imposed finality. But history does not always accept the conclusions handed down in secret rooms. You step back from the courtroom and feel the weight of what has occurred. Justice has been performed without truth. Guilt has been declared without understanding. And the silence that follows is not peace. It is unfinished. Erasure by design. The sentences handed down against members of the Rote Kapelle are not intended merely to punish. They are designed to remove presence, to erase voices, relationships, and meaning from the living world. What follows occurs largely beyond public sight, carried out with bureaucratic efficiency and minimal documentation. You move through this phase not as a witness to events, but as an observer of absence. The way people are removed so thoroughly that even their disappearance feels managed. The executions are scheduled quietly. Dates are set without announcement. Locations are chosen for their isolation. The regime ensures that these acts generate no spectacle, no martyrs, no rallying points. You observe how procedure replaces emotion. Officials speak in administrative language. Records are filed. Life is reduced to case numbers and signatures. The system functions as it was designed to function. For those condemned, the final days are marked not by chaos but by stillness. Time slows. External noise fades. You sense the narrowing of the world to small spaces, cells, corridors, guarded rooms. Some write letters under supervision, careful with their words, knowing each line may be read by strangers. Others sit in silence, preserving their thoughts where no authority can reach them. You observe this interior resistance, the refusal to surrender meaning even as freedom vanishes. Harro Schulze-Boysen faces his sentence with the same composure that shaped his resistance. He does not attempt to reshape the narrative imposed upon him. He understands that words spoken here will not travel. What matters now is coherence of self. You observe him holding that coherence quietly, without display. Arvid Harnack's final period is defined by reflection. His analytical mind, long trained to examine systems, turns inward. He understands that the structure he opposed has chosen annihilation over dialogue. Yet he does not express bitterness. You observe the clarity with which he accepts consequence without conceding error. The distinction matters. Mildred Harnack's fate reflects the regime's fear of intellectual independence. Her nationality, her teaching, her translations, all have been framed as crimes. In her final days, you sense not defeat, but a profound awareness of what ideas can cost. The regime may silence her voice, but it cannot erase the ideas she carried. You observe this tension, authority destroying the body because it cannot destroy thought. Libertas Schulze-Boysen's execution completes the regime's effort to eliminate cultural resistance alongside political dissent. Her creative work is treated as evidence of subversion. The regime understands instinctively that culture shapes memory, and memory shapes judgment. You observe how her removal is intended not just to punish, but to cauterize imagination itself. When the sentences are carried out, the regime records them with chilling economy. No elaboration, no reflection, only completion. You observe how quickly the system moves on, as if the removal of these lives were a clerical task rather than an irrevocable act. Outside the prison walls, families are notified in fragments. Some receive brief notices weeks later. Others hear nothing at all. You observe a family member holding a letter that offers no explanation, no acknowledgement of suffering, only confirmation of finality. The silence imposed on the condemned extends outward, engulfing those who loved them. The regime's next step is erasure. Names are removed from records. Academic references vanish. Cultural contributions are quietly withdrawn. The intention is clear. If the story disappears, the resistance never existed. You observe how quickly this erasure takes effect. Colleagues avoid mentioning names. Institutions revise histories. Fear completes what force began. And yet, erasure is never absolute. Whispers remain. Friends remember. Families preserve fragments, letters hidden in drawers, photographs tucked into books, stories told quietly at kitchen tables. You observe this countercurrent moving beneath official silence. It is small, fragile, and dangerous, but it persists. Within the regime itself, the case of the Rote Kapelle begins to settle into doctrine. Training materials reference it as a cautionary example. Intelligence manuals cite it as proof of foreign infiltration. The metaphor of the orchestra is repeated until it feels true. You observe how repetition hardens fiction into institutional memory. But cracks persist. Some officials note that the supposed hierarchy never fully materialized. Others recognize that the scale of coordination was exaggerated. These doubts are never voiced publicly. They remain personal, buried, inert. The system has no incentive to revisit conclusions once punishment has been delivered. As the war continues and Germany's situation deteriorates, the memory of the Rote Kapelle fades from immediate concern. New crises demand attention. New enemies emerge. The executed are left behind, stripped of context, frozen in the regime's narrative as traitors rather than resistors. You step back from this moment and recognize its deeper meaning. The regime believed it had ended a threat by eliminating individuals. In reality, it revealed its own nature. A system that must erase thought to survive has already lost legitimacy. The people who formed the Rote Kapelle are gone. Their network is dismantled. Their lives have been extinguished. But their absence creates a void that cannot be filled by propaganda alone. Silence settles, not as peace, but as suppression. And history, patient and persistent, begins to wait. Buried stories, unearthed slowly. When the war ends, it does not bring clarity with it. It brings rubble, exhaustion, and the urgent task of survival. In this landscape, stories like that of the Rote Kapelle do not immediately rise to the surface. They lie buried beneath competing narratives, political necessity, and the sheer weight of destruction. You move now into the aftermath years, observing how memory fractures just as surely as cities once did. Germany's defeat collapses the regime that labeled the Rote Kapelle a traitorous conspiracy, but the labels themselves do not vanish. They persist in documents, training manuals, and institutional memory. Many of the files compiled by the Gestapo survive the war intact. Others are seized by Allied forces and transported abroad. These records, deeply biased, often inaccurate, become the first sources available to those trying to understand what happened. You observe historians and officials leafing through these files, encountering the familiar language of the regime: orchestras, conductors, foreign masters. The tone is authoritative. The conclusions appear confident. Few initially question their foundation. In the immediate post-war years, Germany is divided not only physically but morally. Each emerging state, East and West, constructs its own framework for understanding resistance. In the East, Soviet-aligned authorities emphasize espionage and loyalty to Moscow. They elevate certain figures within the Rote Kapelle as heroic agents of socialist resistance, often simplifying or reshaping motivations to fit ideological needs. You observe how nuance is sacrificed for narrative clarity. Complexity becomes inconvenient. In the West, the situation is different but no less distortive. Anti-communism dominates public discourse. Anything associated with Soviet intelligence is viewed with suspicion. As a result, the Rote Kapelle is often remembered not as a resistance movement, but as a spy ring, its members framed as ideologically compromised rather than morally courageous. You watch how former Nazis quietly reintegrated into institutions carry forward this interpretation, ensuring that the stigma attached to the name remains intact. Families of those executed face a second erasure. In neither Germany are they fully acknowledged. Some are discouraged from speaking publicly. Others find that official recognition is denied because their loved ones do not fit the preferred narrative. You observe a widow submitting paperwork for rehabilitation, only to be told that her husband's actions remain politically ambiguous. The language wounds almost as deeply as the silence that preceded it. For years, the Rote Kapelle exists in historical limbo, claimed by no one, understood by few. Their motivations are flattened. Their diversity is ignored. The fact that they were not a single organization, not a unified ideology, not a centrally directed conspiracy is lost beneath the convenience of the label. You observe how the orchestra metaphor, born in the offices of the Gestapo, continues to shape interpretation long after the regime that created it has fallen. It is only gradually, beginning in the 1960s and accelerating in the decades that follow, that this narrative begins to crack. A new generation of historians approaches the surviving documents with skepticism rather than reverence. They cross-reference Gestapo files with personal letters, diaries, and testimonies preserved by families. They notice discrepancies, dates that do not align, hierarchies that never existed, orders that were never given. You observe these scholars piecing together a different picture, one fragment at a time. This work is slow and often resisted. Archives remain closed or selectively accessible. Political sensitivities linger. Some former officials prefer the old narrative because it absolves them of deeper complicity. Others fear that acknowledging genuine German resistance undermines the post-war myth that everyone was deceived. You watch how each newly uncovered detail must fight its way into public consciousness. Gradually, names re-emerge as individuals rather than symbols. Harro Schulze-Boysen is no longer just a conductor, but a Luftwaffe officer who risked everything to warn others of catastrophe. Arvid and Mildred Harnack are recognized not merely as Soviet contacts, but as intellectuals who believed Germany's moral future mattered more than their own safety. Libertas Schulze-Boysen is remembered not just as an accomplice, but as a cultural resistor who understood the power of imagery and narrative. Their lives regain dimension. Historians also begin to understand the true nature of the network. They see that the Rote Kapelle was not a single orchestra, but a loose constellation of people acting independently yet guided by similar convictions. Some shared information with the Soviets because it was the only available channel. Others focused on leaflets, documentation, or moral opposition. The absence of centralized command, once used as evidence of deception, becomes proof of authenticity. You observe how decentralization, once misunderstood, is finally recognized as a strength rather than a flaw. This re-evaluation changes more than academic texts. It alters memorials, curricula, and public discourse. Streets are renamed. Plaques appear. Schools begin to teach these stories with greater honesty. You observe a small ceremony where names long excluded from official remembrance are spoken aloud for the first time. The moment is quiet, almost understated, but it carries immense weight. Yet restoration is never complete. Even today, debates persist about motivation, allegiance, and meaning. Some continue to view the Rote Kapelle through ideological lenses. Others resist acknowledging resistance that does not fit comfortable categories. You observe how history remains contested terrain, not because facts are absent, but because meaning is difficult. As Part A draws to a close, the story of the Rote Kapelle begins to lift from the shadows, not as a myth reclaimed, but as a human truth restored. Their resistance is no longer defined by the label imposed upon them, but by the choices they made under extraordinary pressure. You step back from the archive rooms, memorials, and quiet family stories with a new understanding. History does not always forget. Sometimes it waits. What remains when the noise fades? As the decades pass, the story of the Rote Kapelle settles into a different kind of silence, not the enforced silence of fear, but the quieter space where meaning begins to form. The names are no longer entirely absent. The files are no longer completely sealed. Yet understanding remains fragile. You move through this later landscape carefully, aware that recovery is not the same as closure. What emerges most clearly is how poorly the language of power captures the nature of resistance. The term Red Orchestra, once intended to simplify and diminish, fails to explain what actually happened. There was no single score, no unified conductor, no synchronized performance. What existed instead were individuals who recognized that obedience had become incompatible with conscience. They did not act because they believed success was guaranteed. They acted because refusal felt necessary. You observe how this realization reshapes interpretation. Resistance is no longer measured by its ability to overthrow a regime, but by its refusal to internalize lies. The members of the Rote Kapelle did not stop the war. They did not save themselves, but they disrupted the illusion that unanimity had been achieved. In a system built on the claim that everyone agreed, disagreement itself was destabilizing. Historians come to understand that the greatest threat these individuals posed was not military or strategic, but moral. They demonstrated that access to power did not require loyalty to injustice. Harro Schulze-Boysen, positioned within the Luftwaffe, could have advanced quietly. Instead, he chose friction. Arvid Harnack, embedded in economic planning, could have rationalized compliance. Instead, he chose exposure. Mildred Harnack, an outsider by nationality, could have remained silent. Instead, she chose engagement. Libertas Schulze-Boysen, working in culture and imagery, could have adapted. Instead, she chose subversion. You notice how modern scholarship increasingly emphasizes this aspect, not heroism in the conventional sense, but consistency. These individuals lived in alignment with their understanding of truth, even as consequences became unavoidable. Their resistance was not loud. It was sustained. This understanding reframes failure. The Rote Kapelle did not fail because it was destroyed. It failed only if resistance is defined as victory. If resistance is defined instead as refusing to participate in falsehood, then their work succeeded the moment it began. You observe how this distinction shifts the emotional center of the story. The end is no longer simply tragic. It becomes instructive. Across Germany and Europe, memorials continue to evolve. Some remain modest, plaques on buildings, names engraved in quiet corners. Others become part of educational curricula. You observe students standing before these memorials, learning not just dates and facts, but ethical complexity. They learn that resistance does not always look the same, and that it often emerges from ordinary lives placed under extraordinary pressure. Yet even now, discomfort persists. The Rote Kapelle challenges simple narratives. They were not unified by ideology. Some had contact with Soviet intelligence, others did not. Some focused on espionage, others on leaflets and documentation. Their diversity resists categorization, and categorization is often what societies seek in order to feel resolved. You observe how this discomfort leads some to downplay their significance, to search for purity where none exists. But history rarely offers purity. It offers choices. You step back and consider what the Rote Kapelle reveals about systems of control. The regime they opposed was vast, methodical, and technologically advanced for its time. It collapsed not because of internal resistance alone, but because it could not sustain the weight of its own contradictions. The Rote Kapelle did not cause that collapse, but it revealed the cracks long before they became visible. This is perhaps their most enduring contribution. They remind us that total control is always an illusion. Even in the most surveilled societies, even under the heaviest pressure, there are spaces, mental, moral, relational, where control fails. Resistance lives there, quietly. You observe how this lesson carries forward into the present. The mechanisms of surveillance have evolved. The language of loyalty has changed, but the tension between obedience and conscience remains. The story of the Rote Kapelle does not instruct people to seek martyrdom. It asks a simpler, harder question. At what point does silence become participation? As archives open further and scholarship deepens, the Rote Kapelle increasingly appears not as an anomaly, but as part of a broader human pattern. In every era, there are those who benefit from conformity and those who accept risk to preserve integrity. Most people live somewhere between. The members of the Rote Kapelle crossed a threshold many never will, not because they were exceptional by nature, but because circumstances demanded clarity. You notice how this understanding alters their place in memory. They are no longer romanticized. They are no longer dismissed. They are seen as they were, flawed, intelligent, cautious, brave in uneven ways. Their humanity becomes their strength. As this final chapter draws toward its close, the noise that once surrounded the story, the accusations, the propaganda, the distortions, has faded. What remains is quieter and more durable. A set of lives lived in resistance to moral collapse. A reminder that history is shaped not only by those who command, but by those who refuse. You stand with that understanding now, looking back across the long arc of the story, from whispered conversations in Berlin apartments to courtrooms designed for silence, from erasure to restoration. The Rote Kapelle did not seek to be remembered, but remembrance found them anyway, and in that remembrance lies their final act of resistance. When the quiet returns. The story does not end where the documents stop. When the last file is closed, when the final sentence is carried out, when the buildings where these people once lived return to ordinary use, something remains suspended in the air. It is not triumph. It is not closure. It is a quieter residue, the knowledge that, once, people chose not to align themselves with what surrounded them. You move through Berlin again, but now it is a different city. The war is over. The uniforms have changed. The slogans are gone. Yet the streets remember more than they show. Apartments stand where conversations once unfolded in hushed tones. Offices continue their work where information was once quietly redirected. Courtyards echo with ordinary footsteps, unaware of the weight they carry. Nothing marks these places clearly. That is the nature of quiet resistance. It rarely leaves monuments large enough to interrupt daily life. The members of the Rote Kapelle are often remembered through the lens of failure, arrested, executed, erased. But this is a narrow definition of success, one shaped by power rather than principle. They did not survive. They did not prevail in the way history often prefers. Yet survival was never the measure they chose. They acted because the alternative was internal collapse. In a system that demanded agreement, they refused to agree. In a society trained to equate obedience with safety, they accepted risk. Not recklessly, not theatrically, but deliberately. Their resistance did not announce itself. It did not seek validation. It unfolded in measured steps, careful judgments, and the constant awareness that any day could be the last day of freedom. What makes their story endure is not that they were perfect. It is that they were clear. They understood something that authoritarian systems work tirelessly to obscure. That participation does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like looking away. Sometimes it looks like continuing one's career while telling oneself that responsibility belongs elsewhere. The Rote Kapelle refused that transfer of responsibility. They did not all share the same politics. They did not act from the same ideology. Some believed information could change outcomes. Others believed documentation could preserve truth for a future that might one day ask questions. Some reached outward, seeking to warn. Others looked inward, seeking to disrupt lies at their source. What united them was not a program, but a threshold. They crossed it when they recognized that knowledge carries obligation. History often rewards those who wait until resistance is safe, until outcomes are certain, until moral clarity is widely accepted. The people in this story did not have that luxury. They acted while uncertainty still dominated, while propaganda still convinced millions, while opposition still looked lonely and futile. They acted when it cost the most. After their deaths, the world struggled to know what to do with them. They were inconvenient. Too political for some, too human for others. Their story did not fit neatly into post-war categories, so it was distorted, simplified, delayed. But distortion does not erase truth. It only postpones recognition. Over time, the noise receded. The accusations lost their authority. The documents were reread. The names reappeared. And slowly, a clearer picture emerged, not of an orchestra, not of a conspiracy, but of people who chose to remain internally aligned when alignment carried consequences. That is what remains. Not instructions, not slogans, not a call to replicate their fate, but a reminder that conscience does not announce itself with certainty. It appears quietly, often inconveniently, asking questions that offer no protection. What you do with that question is always personal, always contextual, always costly in ways that cannot be predicted in advance. The rote Kapelle does not demand admiration. It asks for recognition of how fragile moral space becomes under pressure, and how essential it is that someone, somewhere, refuses to let it collapse entirely. As the last echoes fade, the city grows still again. The past does not ask to be relived. It asks only to be understood. You have been walking alongside a story that did not seek witnesses, but left traces nonetheless. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.